Before we dive into today's journey, have you ever experienced something strange while out camping? Share your story in the comments below, and let's build this haven of eerie campfire tales together. My name is Liam Anderson. I'm 34 years old, and this happened last November in Blackwater Falls State Park, West Virginia. I had just landed my first solo freelance assignment, a travel feature for an outdoor magazine. It was my chance to prove to myself and maybe to a few others that I could thrive on my own after leaving a toxic relationship. I didn't expect the park's breathtaking beauty to be marred by whispers of the past, or that those whispers would grow louder with each passing night. When I first arrived, the park was everything I'd hoped for. My RV fit snugly into a secluded campsite overlooking the gorge, the roar of the falls constant in the distance. Blackwater Falls was a photographer's dream. Cascading water, mist rising through the gorge, and vibrant autumn foliage painted in fiery reds and oranges. The first day was perfect. I hiked, shot hundreds of photos, and scribbled notes about the trails and wildlife. The peace and quiet were a balm, exactly what I needed after months of turmoil. That evening, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and scrolling through my shots. That's when I saw it for the first time. At the edge of one frame, a figure stood between two trees. It was a man, his clothes ragged and his face shadowed. I frowned, zooming in, but the details remained blurred. I didn't remember seeing anyone during my hike, and the figure hadn't appeared in any other photos. I shook it off as an optical illusion, probably a trick of light and shadows, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second day brought strange encounters. I started the morning by stopping at the visitor center, hoping to get some local insight. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, was friendly but seemed to be watching me too closely. She eyed my camera gear and smiled knowingly. "Planning to photograph the falls?" she asked. "That's the idea," I replied. Maggie hesitated, her smile faltering. "Be careful around the falls, especially near dusk. The dead don't like company." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Before I could ask more, she turned to help another guest, leaving me with a vague unease. Later, on a trail to the falls, I ran into Gary, a park ranger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a genial demeanor. As he gave me a quick overview of the park's history, I brought up Maggie's warning. He chuckled. "Oh, that's just local folklore. Back in the Civil War, there was a Confederate soldier who hid out in the gorge. They say he deserted his regiment and was hunted down near the falls. Some folks claim his spirit never left, but I've worked here for years and never seen a thing." I tried to laugh with him, but his words stayed with me. That evening, the first real sign of something unnatural occurred. I set up my tripod near the falls, hoping to capture the golden hour light. As I framed the shot, my breath caught. The air around me had turned frigid, my breath fogging in front of me despite the mild weather. My camera refused to focus, the lens shuddering as if something was blocking it. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard whispers. I spun around expecting to see other hikers, but I was alone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and indecipherable, like a crowd speaking just out of earshot. The unease became unbearable, and I packed up in a rush, leaving the falls as the last light of day faded. That night back at the RV, I reviewed the day's photos. Most were stunning. The falls bathed in warm golden light. But in 3 of them, the figure from the previous day appeared again. This time, he was closer, standing at the edge of the water. His face was clearer now, pale, gaunt, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been. And in the last photo, he was staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut and locked the RV door. The next morning, I debated cutting the trip short, but a part of me couldn't let it go. I'd always prided myself on being rational, and I wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences ruin my assignment. While hiking near the falls, I noticed an overgrown side trail. Curiosity tugged at me, and I followed it, ducking beneath low-hanging branches. It led to a clearing where the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. In the center of the clearing was a patch of disturbed earth, as though something had been buried there long ago. Nearby, I found an object half buried in the dirt, a weathered leather journal. The pages were brittle but legible, written in a looping, old-fashioned script. The entries told the story of a Confederate soldier who had deserted his regiment and fled into the gorge. His words were filled with fear and desperation. The nights grow colder, and I hear them coming. I cannot outrun my fate. The last entry read, "They will find me tonight. I will not see another sunrise." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive feeling returned. The RV's lights flickered and shadows danced across the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the firelight outside. And then I saw him. The soldier stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. He didn't move, didn't blink, but his hollow eyes locked onto mine. My chest tightened with fear as I realized he wasn't alone. Shadows emerged from the trees, darker and more twisted, their forms writhing like smoke. They whispered accusations, voices overlapping in a cacophony. "Traitor! Coward! You will not leave!" Panicking, I grabbed the journal and held it up. "Is this what you want?" I shouted. The soldier's expression shifted. Sadness, perhaps gratitude, and he gestured toward the disturbed earth I'd seen earlier. I understood. Clutching the journal, I ran back to the clearing. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. My hands shook as I placed the journal on the grave and whispered a quiet prayer for peace. The air around me grew still. The shadows stopped, their forms dissolving into the night. The soldier lingered for a moment longer, his hollow eyes softening before fading into the mist. By morning, the oppressive feeling had lifted. The forest seemed brighter, the air lighter, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Before leaving, I stopped at the visitor center to return the journal. Maggie was there, her knowing smile greeting me. "You helped him, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She reached out, patting my hand. "He's free now. You did a good thing." As I drove away from Blackwater Falls, I realized the experience had changed me. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer felt the weight of doubt and fear that had followed me into the park. Sometimes the past lingers in ways we can't explain, and sometimes all it takes to move forward is to lay it to rest. Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. I always thought the vastness of the desert would calm me. It's what I needed after everything that had happened at work. The constant pressure, the unrelenting deadlines, the suffocating feeling of being boxed into the same routine. I planned the trip to Big Bend National Park months ago, thinking a week away from it all would clear my head. Solitude in the desert seemed like the perfect way to hit the reset button. I'd heard the stories, of course, rumors of spiritual significance, whispered legends passed down by native tribes, but I'd never put much stock in that kind of thing. They were just stories, right? I was wrong. Big Bend is a place where the land meets the sky in such a dramatic way that it's almost unnerving. The sun bakes the earth by day, and at night, the stars stretch endlessly, a canopy of light over the barren landscape. The silence is deafening, and out here, far away from everything, it feels like the world is holding its breath. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the distant Chisos Mountains. My plan was simple: hike the trail to the window, a spot famous for its breathtaking sunset views. I'd set up camp, spend the night there, and continue deeper into the wilderness the next day. A week alone, away from the noise of civilization, I'd been craving this. Everything seemed perfect at first. The air was dry and warm, the trail rugged but manageable, and my gear was top-notch, a mix of high-end camping equipment and essentials I'd collected over the years. I felt prepared, confident, ready to let the desert cleanse my mind. But that feeling didn't last. By the time I reached my campsite, I noticed my GPS was flickering, the signal coming and going without explanation. I chalked it up to a glitch. Maybe the battery was low, though I had checked it before I left. Then my phone started to act strange. The battery, which had been at 80% when I arrived, drained rapidly, dropping to 20% in just a few minutes. No big deal, I thought. I wasn't here to use my phone. After all, this was supposed to be my escape from technology. As I set up my tent, the sun dipped below the horizon and the cold winds swept through the canyon. I hadn't expected the temperature to drop so quickly, and I fumbled through my pack for my jacket. My hands were shaking, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. That's when I heard it, the first sign that something wasn't right. It was faint at first, just a whisper carried on the wind, so soft I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, rhythmic, almost like chanting, echoing through the canyon. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear. There was nothing, just the sound of the wind. "Get it together, Tyler," I muttered to myself. I was overthinking things again, the wind through the rocks, that's all it was. My mind playing tricks on me, feeding into my anxieties like it always did. I finished setting up camp and tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. The silence was oppressive, heavy, as if the desert itself was waiting for something. I tried to brush it off. I was just tired, exhausted, really. That night, as I lay in my tent, the whispers returned, louder this time, clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something real. The whispers grew, surrounding me, coming from every direction. They weren't in English, not even Spanish. It was an ancient language, guttural and rhythmic, like a chant I couldn't understand. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart racing. I reached for my flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam sputtered and died. My hands fumbled in the darkness, searching for my backup lantern. When I found it, I clicked it on, flooding the tent with light, but the whispers didn't stop. They only seemed to get closer. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just anxiety. Something was out there. I stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The fire I'd built earlier had long since died down to embers. I looked around, scanning the landscape with my lantern. That's when I saw it. The small stone cairns, dozens of them, scattered around the edges of my campsite like tiny tombstones. They hadn't been there when I set up camp. I was sure of it. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here. Or something. My mind raced. Could it have been other hikers? A prank, maybe? But the trail had been empty when I arrived, and this was an isolated spot. No one would have come this far just to mess with me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. My hands were shaking as I backed toward my tent, the beam of my lantern swinging wildly across the ground. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement. A shadow, just at the edge of the light, darting between the rocks. It was too fast to be human. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the lantern around, trying to catch another glimpse, but there was nothing. Just the empty desert. I bolted back into my tent, zipping it shut behind me, as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. I sat there, gripping the lantern, listening to the whispers fade into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made my heart jump. Every gust of wind felt like something moving just outside. By morning, the whispers were gone, but the unease lingered. I packed up camp, deciding to cut my trip short. I'd head back to the trailhead, call it a failure, and go home. There was no shame in that. But as I started hiking back, something was off. The trail didn't look right. The landmarks, the rock formations, they weren't where they should have been. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself, but nothing matched. It was like the land itself had shifted overnight. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank, dead. My phone, too, had lost all power. Panic set in. I was lost, completely, utterly lost in the middle of the desert. I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe. I could find my way back. I just retraced my steps. But no matter how far I walked, the landscape seemed to warp around me, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. My footprints, which should have been visible in the sand, were gone, erased, as if I'd never walked that way at all. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on me, but the cold from the night before hadn't left. It clung to me, seeping into my bones. And then I saw it again. The shadow. It was further away this time, just a dark figure standing on the ridge, watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin. I couldn't make out any features, just its silhouette against the sky. It didn't move. It didn't come closer. It just stood there, watching. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get away from it. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I scrambled over the rocks, my pack bouncing against my back. But no matter how far I ran, the figure was always there, always just at the edge of my vision, standing still, waiting. My mind raced with the legends I'd read before the trip. Stories of La Malahora, the evil hour, a spirit that lured travelers to their doom. It was said to appear just before tragedy struck, a warning of death. I hadn't believed in those stories, not really. But now, with the shadows stalking me, I wasn't so sure. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert. I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind frayed. I couldn't keep running. I had to face it. I stopped, turning to look at the ridge behind me. The shadow was closer now, standing still, its dark form blending with the rocks. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I'm not afraid," I said aloud, though my voice wavered. "I'm not afraid of you." The shadow didn't move, but I felt its presence, heavy and oppressive, weighing down on me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stand my ground. Slowly, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the landscape like smoke. The whispers, too, faded into the wind, growing quieter until they were gone. I stood there for a long time, the desert silent once more. The sky darkened above me. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. The next morning, I found the trail. The landscape had returned to normal, the landmarks in the right places, as if nothing had changed. I made my way back to the trailhead, my legs weak, my mind still spinning from the encounter. I left Big Bend that day, never to return. Some people might say it was just my imagination, that the isolation and the anxiety had gotten to me. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The desert is a place of mystery, a place where the veil between worlds is thin, and sometimes something crosses over. My name is Noah Bennett, and I was 32 years old when this happened in the fall of 2023. I've always been a skeptic. Science, facts, logic. That's my religion. Ghost stories and urban legends, they're just entertainment, a way for people to make sense of what they can't explain. At least, that's what I thought before that weekend in Dolly Sods. It was supposed to be a routine backpacking trip, just me, my best friend Chris, and his girlfriend Lila. Chris and I had been hiking together since college, and while Lila was newer to the group, she was no rookie. She'd done some Appalachian Trail sections and could hold her own. The plan was simple: 3 days in Dolly Sods wilderness, a rugged stretch of land in West Virginia known for its otherworldly landscapes. Chris had picked it after reading about its haunted reputation. I rolled my eyes but agreed. It would be a good story for him to tell over beers. We set off on a Friday morning, our packs heavy with gear, water, and food. The first few hours were uneventful. The air was crisp, the trail well-marked, and the scenery stunning. Lila walked a few paces ahead, her long braids swinging as she stopped every so often to snap photos. Chris was his usual self, cracking jokes about the ghosts watching us. "You think Casper's going to show up and roast marshmallows with us?" he said, nudging my arm. "More like Bigfoot," I replied. "Hope you packed extra jerky." By midday, we'd veered off the main trail onto a less traveled path. That was our first mistake. Chris insisted it would be more authentic. A word that always meant trouble. Lila looked uneasy, but didn't argue. I should have turned us back then, but my pride wouldn't let me admit we were heading into uncharted territory. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The sky was clear and the stars were so bright you could almost forget civilization existed. After dinner, we sat around the fire, trading stories and laughing. Lila was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to the trees every so often. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said quickly, forcing a smile. I don't know. This place feels weird, like it's watching us." Chris laughed. "The sods have eyes, huh? Don't worry, babe, I'll protect you from the big bad forest." I rolled my eyes. "Let's call it a night. Long day tomorrow." We crawled into our tents and I was out within minutes. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of whispers, faint, like they were carried on the wind. I lay still, straining to hear. It wasn't words exactly, more like a murmur, but it felt deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. "Chris?" I called softly. No answer. I swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. Just the flicker of dying embers in the fire pit and the sway of the trees. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to sleep. The next morning, Lila looked pale, dark circles under her eyes. "You okay?" Chris asked, pouring her a cup of instant coffee. She hesitated. "I heard something last night. Whispering." Chris grinned. "See, I told you, ghosts. They probably wanted some s'mores." I expected her to laugh, but she didn't. Instead, she shot me a look like she was silently asking if I'd heard it too. I nodded, and her face tightened. We packed up and moved on, but the mood was different. Lila kept glancing over her shoulder, and even Chris was quieter than usual. By midday, our GPS started acting up, refusing to lock onto satellites. I pulled out the paper map, but it was no use. The terrain didn't match anything on it. We were lost. "Let's just backtrack," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Chris shook his head. "We're fine. The trail's got to be around here somewhere." We pressed on, but the more we walked, the stranger things became. The trees seemed closer together, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. And then there were the tracks. Hoof prints in the mud, but not from any deer. They were too deep, too large. Some even looked like they ended in clawed toes. I tried to dismiss them, but Lila froze when she saw them. "This isn't normal," she whispered. Chris shrugged. "Probably just an old cow or something." "In the middle of dolly sods," she snapped. "We're miles from any farms." We kept walking, but the tension was palpable. That evening we stumbled upon a clearing with a circle of stones in the center. At first, I thought it was a fire pit, but as we got closer, I saw the bones, animal bones, bleached white and arranged in strange patterns. Chris let out a nervous laugh. "Well, that's not creepy at all." "We need to leave," Lila said firmly. "Now." "It's just some weirdo's idea of art," Chris said, but even he looked uneasy. "Let's camp somewhere else." We moved another mile before setting up camp, but none of us slept well. The whispers came again, louder this time and closer. They weren't just sounds, they were voices calling our names. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like Chris outside my tent, his voice low and urgent. "Vincent, come here." I unzipped the tent, but he wasn't there, just darkness and the rustle of leaves. When I checked his tent, he was sound asleep. The next morning, Lila refused to go any further. "I'm done," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to go back." "We don't even know which way back is," Chris argued. "Then we stay put and wait for help." "Out here with no signal? No way." I sided with Chris, though I regretted it almost immediately. By midday, we were hopelessly lost, the forest closing in around us. That's when it took Chris. He'd wandered off to relieve himself while Lila and I rested by a fallen log. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When he didn't come back, we called his name. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and started searching, Lila close behind. We found him an hour later, or what was left of him. He was hanging from a tree, his face twisted in terror, his body mangled like something had torn him apart. Lila screamed, and I barely kept from throwing up. We didn't stay to examine him. We ran. By nightfall, we were utterly lost. The whispers followed us, louder now, more insistent. And then we saw it, a figure at the edge of our firelight. It looked human, but its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally. Its glowing eyes burned into me, and when it spoke, it used my voice. "Vincent, come here." Lila started chanting under her breath, something about sage and protection. The figure hissed and retreated, but I knew it wasn't gone. We didn't sleep that night, and by dawn we were stumbling through the forest, exhausted and terrified. When we finally reached the edge of the woods, I almost cried. We collapsed near a ranger's station, and when they found us, we tried to explain, but no one believed us. They chalked it up to exposure and trauma. Chris's body was never found. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't plan to. Whatever's out there, it's not meant to be understood. And I know one thing for sure, some legends are real. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 37, a retired firefighter, and this happened in Seneca Creek backcountry, West Virginia, a year after I lost my wife, Emily. I planned the trip hoping to find peace or at least distraction in nature. What I found was something I can never forget. It started as a simple RV camping trip, my first time alone. Emily and I had always loved the outdoors, and this seemed like a way to reconnect with that part of my life. Seneca Creek, with its waterfalls and isolation, felt like the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts. I told myself the solitude would help, that it was what I needed. I wasn't ready for what came next. The drive into the backcountry was uneventful. The gravel road leading to the campsite felt endless, hemmed in by towering trees that cast long shadows even in the midday sun. I stopped at a small gas station near the turnoff, where an older woman named Marlene ran the counter. "You're heading into Seneca Creek?" she asked as I paid for firewood and a few snacks. I nodded. "Yeah, just me and the RV." Marlene gave me a strange look, her hand pausing over the register. "Be careful out there," she said, her voice low. "These woods aren't always kind to those traveling alone." I wanted to ask what she meant, but she turned away to help another customer. Her words lingered in my mind as I drove the final stretch. The campsite by Judy Springs was everything I'd hoped for: quiet, picturesque, and completely isolated. I parked the RV near the creek, the sound of rushing water a soothing backdrop as I unpacked. That first night, I sat by the fire, sipping coffee and staring at the stars. For the first time in months, I felt calm. The first sign that something wasn't right came the next evening. The day had been perfect. I hiked to Seneca Falls, taking photos and jotting notes in a journal I'd started since Emily's death. I even smiled a few times, thinking about how much she would have loved the view. But as I headed back to camp, a strange feeling crept over me. The woods were too quiet, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots on the trail. When I reached the RV, the unease deepened. My firewood, neatly stacked by the pit, was scattered across the ground. At first, I thought an animal had gotten into it, but the pieces were arranged strangely, like they'd been tossed deliberately. I shrugged it off and rebuilt the fire, telling myself I was imagining things. But that night, as I sat by the flames, I saw it for the first time, a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't the flicker of firelight. This was deliberate, purposeful, like someone pacing at the edge of the forest. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, the sound of my own voice startling me. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. Nothing. But as I turned back to the fire, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A shape, humanoid but wrong, slipping behind a tree and vanishing before I could focus on it. I slept in the RV that night, the doors locked and curtains drawn. The third day brought more unsettling signs. I woke to find muddy footprints leading from the creek to the RV. They were human-like but elongated, the toes too long and splayed. They stopped abruptly a few feet from the door, as if whoever or whatever made them had simply vanished. That afternoon, while hiking to an overlook, I stumbled upon something even stranger: symbols carved into the rocks. They weren't like any markings I'd seen before, almost as if they were burned into the stone. The air felt heavier there, as if the forest were holding its breath. I hurried back to camp, but the unease followed me. That night, the shadows returned. This time, they were closer. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The shadowy figure appeared again, standing motionless at the edge of the trees. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were unnaturally long. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice breaking. It didn't move. The fire flickered, the flames shrinking as if smothered by an unseen force. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. By the fourth morning, I'd had enough. I packed up, determined to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine cranked but refused to turn over. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I decided to hike back to the gas station for help. I marked my trail carefully, leaving a breadcrumb of sticks and rocks so I wouldn't get lost. But the forest had other plans. No matter which direction I went, the paths looped back to my campsite. I walked for hours, my legs aching, only to find myself standing in front of the RV again. As the sun set, the shadows returned. This time there were more of them. Figures moved through the trees surrounding the campsite, their glowing yellow eyes piercing the darkness. I barricaded myself inside the RV, clutching a flare gun I'd brought for emergencies. The shadows circled outside, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the silence. Then the radio came on. Static filled the air, crackling and distorted before a song began to play. A song I hadn't heard since Emily's funeral. It was her favorite, and hearing it now here made my blood run cold. Her voice followed, faint and pleading. "Vincent, leave." I stared at the radio, my hands trembling. "Emily?" The voice came again, softer this time. "You have to go." The shadows closed in, their forms pressing against the windows of the RV. I fired the flare through the nearest window, the bright red light igniting the darkness. The figures recoiled, their shapes dissolving like smoke. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the keys and tried the ignition one last time. The engine roared to life. I drove through the night, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The forest seemed alive, the trees bending unnaturally as if trying to block my escape. When I finally reached the gas station, Marlene was waiting. She didn't seem surprised to see me, but her expression unreadable. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. Marlene sighed. "It's the Shadow Man. He feeds on people's grief, their fear. He doesn't kill. He traps you, keeps you lost in the dark until there's nothing left." I left West Virginia the next day, vowing never to return. The shadows are gone now, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if the Shadow Man ever truly let me go. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions. But there I was, driving deeper into Gifford Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore. Vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer. Damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The farther I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a gray blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow, I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map, it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. "Hello?" My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time, there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me. Cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer, but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I had come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out. But it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't getting out. My name is James Dalton, and back in 2007, I was camped out in my RV at Devil's River State Natural Area in Texas. The irony wasn't lost on me, camping at a place called Devil's River. But the spot had rave reviews from folks who swore it was the best place to get away from the world. At the time, getting away was exactly what I needed. Just me, my secondhand RV, and no one around to bother me. I'd come down after my business took a hit, figuring some solitude would straighten me out. Give me time to think, like people say. Now, if you've never been to Devil's River, picture this. Miles of desert scrub, dusty as you can imagine, with narrow paths winding through thorny mesquite and juniper trees. The river itself is cold and clear, carved through canyons with cliffs jutting up on either side, giving the area this closed-in, almost claustrophobic feel. You're out there, and it feels like the rest of the world doesn't exist. So, I'm about 3 days into my little retreat when things get strange. Now, I'm not one for superstitions or spooking myself, but the first night, I heard some noises outside my RV. I chalked it up to animals, coyotes or raccoons, maybe. There were these quiet, shuffling sounds, like something dragging along the ground, but I ignored it, thinking it was probably just the wind. On the second night, I heard something again, only this time it was closer. There was a light scraping against the side of the RV. It sounded almost deliberate, like someone running a stick along the metal siding. I grabbed a flashlight, flicked it on, and looked out the window. Nothing. Just the scrub bushes and the dark stretch of riverbank. But I could feel something out there, just beyond the reach of the light. I laughed it off, maybe a little too loudly, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But I knew something was off. Day 3, I decided to go for a hike down the river trail to shake off whatever jitters I had picked up. I'm walking along, minding my own business, when I spot this old abandoned campsite tucked back in the trees. There was a tent, half collapsed, with bits of clothing scattered around and a rusty, bent knife lying in the dirt. Now, I'm no detective, but even I could tell something didn't sit right. It looked like whoever was here left in a real hurry. But that knife, that caught my attention. It wasn't just bent. It looked twisted, like someone had jammed it against something hard, something unyielding. Now, here's where things get serious. That night, after a long day of hiking, I'm sitting by my RV, grilling up some dinner. It was that perfect, eerie quiet that comes only when you're truly alone. And then I smelled it. A sharp, sour stench that hit me out of nowhere, like rotting meat mixed with damp soil. I glanced around, but there was nothing in sight, just the darkening desert. Figuring some animal had met an unfortunate end nearby, I shrugged it off. But when I stepped back inside the RV, that smell hit me full force. It was like it had seeped into the walls. I threw open the windows thinking maybe it would clear out, but that only made it worse. And that's when I heard it. A faint, muffled, groaning sound coming from right under my RV. I'll admit it, I froze. My heart was pounding, my hands slick on the flashlight as I bent down, shining the beam underneath. And there it was. A filthy, pale figure lying on the ground, half hidden in the shadows. His clothes were in tatters, and he was muttering to himself, something I couldn't quite make out. His face was a mess, crusted with dirt, and his hands were bloody, like he'd been dragging himself along the ground. I managed to get a grip and shouted, "Hey, what the hell are you doing here?" He looked up, his face blank, like he didn't even register I was mine. I was there. Then he started laughing, a low, humorless laugh that sounded like it was scraping out of his throat. "You're next," he said, voice slurred like he was in a daze. "Next for what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But he just kept muttering to himself, a string of words that sounded like nonsense, broken up by bouts of laughter. At this point, I was ready to pack up and hightail it out of there, but he reached up, grabbing the side of the RV with one hand, and heaved himself to his feet. I took a step back, thinking I'd keep my distance, but he lunged forward faster than I expected. His other hand swung up, and I realized he was holding that twisted knife I'd seen earlier. It was like the air itself froze. He was muttering something about purging the filth, words that made my skin crawl. I was stuck, backed against the RV with nowhere to go as he came closer, his eyes unfocused, but full of this sick determination. That's when I remembered the grill fork I'd left sitting on the picnic table. I grabbed it, clutching it like my life depended on it, and believe me, it did. He lunged again, slashing with that twisted knife, but I managed to dodge. The knife grazed past my arm. I jammed the grill fork forward, catching him in the side, and he let out a strangled grunt, staggering back. He looked down at the fork sticking out of him, his face twisting into this grotesque smile. "You're filth too," he rasped, pulling the fork out like it was nothing. Blood started pouring down his side, but he didn't seem to care. We were locked in this sick game of cat and mouse around the RV, me with my grill fork, him with that mangled knife. He came at me again, and this time I managed to knock the knife out of his hand, sending it skittering under the RV. He didn't even flinch, just lunged forward with both hands, trying to choke me. I was fighting for air, pushing against him with everything I had, when I saw headlights, another camper pulling in down the trail. In the split second he was distracted, I swung the grill fork as hard as I could, catching him across the face. He staggered back, stunned, and I took the chance to shove him off me and ran toward the other camper's headlights, yelling for help. The driver jumped out, seeing the blood on my arm and the crazed look in my eyes. I don't even remember what I said, but he called the cops immediately. They found the guy lying in a heap next to my RV, unconscious from blood loss. Turns out, he was an escaped convict, a psycho with a history of violent attacks. The next morning, after the cops cleared out, I took a good look around that abandoned campsite again. Buried under some rocks near where I found the knife were bones, human bones, picked clean and brittle. They figured he'd been hiding out there for weeks, surviving on whatever he could catch, animal or otherwise. I left Devil's River that day, making one last stop at a diner to shake off the adrenaline. When the waitress asked where I'd come from, I just said, Devil's River. And she laughed, like I was telling a joke. My name is Lucas Everett, and I was 33 when this happened. It was early May 2024, and I had just finished a grueling 6-month contract as a travel nurse in Baltimore. The job had been brutal, long shifts, heartbreaking cases, and one patient I couldn't save no matter how hard I tried. His face still lingered in my mind, and I needed space to breathe. That's why I bought the RV. I had no plan except to drive, park somewhere beautiful, and let the quiet heal me. That's how I ended up at Sakika Creek near Smoko Canyon, West Virginia. The locals called it Devil's Gorge, but I didn't care about the name. I cared about the view. The pull-off was perfect, isolated and perched right on the edge of the gorge. The air was cool and smelled of pine, and the canyon spread out below me in jagged cliffs and swirling mist. I parked my RV, stepped out, and just stood there, letting the silence soak into my bones. I felt a glimmer of peace for the first time in months. My plan was simple: hike, take some photos, and not think about anything for a while. I grabbed my camera and followed a faint trail along the edge of the gorge. The path wound through dense trees, their branches forming a canopy so thick it felt like dusk even though it was mid-afternoon. That's when I found it. The stone altar was tucked into a hollow half hidden by vines and moss. It looked ancient, weathered, and wrong. There was something unnatural about its placement, like it didn't belong here. Carved into its surface was the word malum, Latin for evil, I said. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, but I couldn't stop myself from snapping a photo. It was eerie and beautiful in its own way, and I knew it would make a great addition to my collection. I was just turning to leave when I heard it. A whisper, faint and raspy, like dry leaves brushing together. Leave. I froze, staring into the trees, but there was no one there. My pulse quickened as I backed away from the altar, stumbling a little on the uneven ground. I told myself it was just the wind. It had to be the wind. That night, the wind came back. I was editing photos in the RV when I heard it, a soft scratching sound like claws against metal. My stomach clenched as I turned off the lights, peering through the window. The moon cast long shadows across the ground, but there was nothing there. I stepped outside, armed with my flashlight, and saw the marks, claw-like scratches raked down the side of the RV. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I swung the flashlight toward the trees, half expecting to see an animal, a bear, maybe. But the forest was still. Too still. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just silence. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I realized I was trembling. Probably just a raccoon, I muttered, but I didn't believe it. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. The scratches were weird, sure, but it was the middle of the woods. Animals did strange things. I packed a lunch and decided to hike deeper into the canyon. Maybe I'd find a new trail, something to distract me. The gorge was stunning, its cliffs rising like jagged teeth on either side. The air felt heavy, as if the canyon was holding its breath, but I pushed forward. That's when I started noticing them, symbols. They were carved into the trees and scratched into the dirt, strange and unfamiliar. At first, I thought they were just graffiti, but they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. They made my skin crawl. The trail led me to a dead end, a sheer drop into the gorge below. As I turned to head back, I heard it again, the whisper. It came from the trees, faint and raspy. Amber. I froze. My name. It had whispered my name. I practically ran back to the RV, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got inside, I locked the doors and pulled down the blinds, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the fear wouldn't leave me. It sat heavy in my stomach, coiling tighter with every hour that passed. That night, I woke to something worse. It started with the whispers, soft and insistent, coming from all directions. Then came the knocking. Tap, 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 on the windows, on the door, on the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window, but the light only seemed to make the shadows move. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the firelight, gaunt and impossibly tall, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Her face was a patchwork of cracked skin, like porcelain shattered and glued back together. And her eyes, black, empty voids, locked onto mine. The whisper turned into a scream, piercing and relentless, and I stumbled back, clutching my ears. When I looked again, she was gone. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could, desperate to put miles between me and the gorge. But the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, no matter how many times I turned the key. I grabbed my pack and started walking, following the road back to the main highway. But every time I thought I was making progress, the path looped back to the gorge. It was impossible, like the forest was twisting itself around me. By the time the sun began to set, I was back at the RV, exhausted and terrified. The final night was the worst. I built a fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. It didn't. The whispers started again, louder this time, and the witch appeared just beyond the light. She didn't lunge or attack. She just watched, her cracked face stretching into a horrible grin. And then she spoke. "You let him die, didn't you?" Her voice was a knife cutting into the guilt I tried so hard to bury. "You could have saved him." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It wasn't my fault. You failed him." I screamed, grabbing the camera and flipping through my photos, desperate for answers. That's when I saw the altar. The carvings were clear now, showing a ritual, a way to banish her. It required a sacrifice. I grabbed my medical kit, my hands trembling as I pulled out a scalpel. The witch was closer now, her shadow looming over the fire. I took a deep breath, pressed the blade to my palm, and dragged it across the skin. Blood pooled in my hand, warm and sticky, and I smeared it onto the photo of the altar. The air seemed to shatter. The witch screamed, high and shrill, and the fire roared to life. Her form twisted and buckled, pulled toward the gorge as if by invisible chains. I pressed my bleeding hand to the ground, whispering the Latin words I'd seen carved into the stone. Malum, a beat. Evil, be gone. The witch collapsed into the earth, her body dissolving into ash. And then, just like that, the forest was still. When the sun rose, the RV started without a problem. I drove until I hit the highway, not daring to look back. The photos I took in the gorge were corrupted, every one of them except for one. It showed the witch standing in the shadows, watching me. I deleted it. I haven't camped alone since. The mist rolled in quicker than I'd expected, but I didn't mind. I loved the fog, loved the way it muted everything, softened the edges of the world, made it all feel a little more mysterious. It was perfect for my project. Whispers of the Wild was going to be my best work yet. I could feel it after everything I'd been through in the past year, hell, in the past month. This was the reset I needed. Just me, my camera, and the Smoky Mountains. No one to answer to, no one to lean on, just the way I liked it. I hefted my backpack higher on my shoulders and adjusted my camera strap. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I'd expected, but that was part of the draw. The more remote the location, the better the shot. No tourists ruining the landscape with their neon jackets or loud conversations, just untouched wilderness. But untouched wilderness had its downsides. My camera had been acting up since I'd arrived. I'd missed some great shots because of it. Fog rolling over the peaks, a hawk perched on a branch just feet away. But I told myself I didn't care. This trip wasn't about getting everything right. It was about getting away. I paused to catch my breath and set the camera down on a fallen log. The lens fogged up almost instantly in the damp air, and when I wiped it off with the corner of my jacket, I realized I'd smeared dirt across it. Typical. "Come on," I muttered, digging into my bag for a lens cloth. As I crouched there, rubbing at the stubborn streak of mud, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker. There were plenty of them around these parts, but it didn't sound right. Too slow, too steady. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I looked up, but the fog was thickening, swallowing the trees just a few yards ahead of me. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. I wasn't scared of being out here alone. In fact, I preferred it. No one to distract me, no one to get in my head. Still, the silence that followed felt too quiet, like something was waiting. I shoved the lens cloth back into my pack and stood up, forcing myself to move on. I had a campsite to reach before dark, and I wasn't about to get spooked by a weird noise, at least not this early in the trip. The fog never really lifted by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I set up my tent quickly, more out of habit than anything else, though I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I wasn't sure why. There was no one around, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, not even a bird call to break the stillness. I figured a good night's sleep would shake off the nerves. I was just tired. The last few months had been brutal. Breaking up with Paul, the constant fights before it, the way he made me feel like I couldn't do anything right. This trip was supposed to be my way of proving him wrong, proving to myself that I didn't need him, that I didn't need anyone. But the anxiety crept up on me anyway, a tight knot in my chest as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent. Then there was that tapping again, faint and far off. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, just the wind, just the forest. But then it stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch, and I heard something else. Something worse. A whisper. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it was there, threading through the fog outside. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, but it was too rhythmic to be wind, too deliberate. I sat up, listening hard, my heart racing. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it through the thin walls of the tent. Just mist and shadows. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed felt alive, thick with something I couldn't name. I switched off the light, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I just wanted to get moving. The fog had lifted slightly, but the forest felt wrong somehow, like it was holding its breath. I didn't like it. I wanted to get to higher ground, get some better shots, and move on. By midday, I'd made it to a rocky ridge that overlooked a valley. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of shot I'd come for. The fog clung to the trees below, creating a sea of white with the mountain peaks poking through like islands. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. When I reviewed the pictures on my camera, my breath caught in my throat. There were figures in the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows cast by the trees. But the more I zoomed in, the clearer they became. Tall, thin shapes, barely visible but definitely there, human or something like it, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. I whipped my head around, scanning the valley below. There was no one, just mist and trees. But in the photos, the figures were there. I lowered the camera, heart pounding. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. And yet, the air around me felt suddenly cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with a change in the weather. This was different, deeper, like it had seeped into my bones. I should have left right then, packed up and headed back to the main trail. But I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping me here, pulling me deeper into the wilderness. That night, I camped by a small stream. I hadn't seen any more figures, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I felt like I was being watched, constantly. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's photos. That's when I noticed something else. The figures in the fog weren't in just one picture. They were in all of them. Some barely visible, others clearer, standing in groups or alone, always watching, always there. My hands started shaking and I nearly dropped the camera. It was impossible. I'd been out there for hours and I hadn't seen anyone. Not a single hiker, no animals, no birds, but there they were in every shot. Suddenly, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The beam of light cut through the mist, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the whispering grew louder, like it was circling me, coming from all directions at once. You shouldn't be here. That's what it sounded like, a woman's voice, soft but firm, blending with the rustling leaves and flowing water. It wasn't clear, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't welcome. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and back toward the tent. The whispering followed me, growing sharper, angrier. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, dressed in old, ragged clothes. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with sorrow. She didn't move. She just stood there watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The flashlight flickered back to life, and the whispering stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn broke, I knew I had to leave. This wasn't some trick of the mind. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was something in these woods, something angry, and I had trespassed. I packed up my gear in record time and set off toward the trailhead. But the forest seemed different now, like the trees were closing in on me. The path I'd taken to get here was gone, swallowed by the fog. My compass spun wildly, useless, and the map was no help in the unmarked wilderness. Panic gnawed at my insides as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. And all the while, I could feel her watching, waiting. The whispering started again as I crossed a small clearing, louder this time, angrier. I dropped my pack, desperate, and spun around. There she was, standing in the mist, her eyes locked on mine. I fell to my knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible over the growing wind. "I didn't mean to." Her expression softened just slightly, and for the first time I felt something other than fear. She wasn't just angry. She was in pain. "I'm sorry," I repeated, louder this time. "I shouldn't be here. I didn't know." The wind died down. The whispering faded, and slowly the figure in the mist began to dissolve, melting back into the fog. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart racing, too afraid to move. But she was gone. The air felt lighter, the forest less oppressive. When I finally stood, I saw it. Small, barely visible in the fog, a stone, hidden among the trees, a grave, long forgotten, buried deep in the wilderness. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get close. I just stood there for a moment, paying my respects to the spirit I'd disturbed. Then, without looking back, I turned and walked away. I made it out of the Smokies that day, but the images, the figures in the fog, the woman's sorrowful eyes, followed me. I never published the photos from that trip. Some things I realized weren't meant to be captured. Some things were meant to be left alone. My name is Mason Ford, and it was back in 2018 when I set off in my rickety RV toward the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. I'd been meaning to make this trip for years, dreaming of peaceful evenings by a campfire, maybe some half-decent fishing and stargazing with my trusty mutt, Lou. Lou was about the only company I had left after a messy divorce and a career that went belly up. So there we were, just a man, his dog, and the open road. Sounded good on paper. The first few days went smoothly. No phone calls, no work stress, just me and Lou with the mountains rolling past. But on the third day, I pulled into a secluded clearing I'd scouted online, planning to stay there for the night. The place was dead quiet, and the air felt still, like the whole world had hit the pause button. A perfect spot, or so I thought. That night, as I was trying to get a fire going, I heard something that sounded like footsteps just beyond the tree line. I brushed it off as a deer or some other wildlife, maybe hoping it wasn't a bear. The footsteps would stop when I stopped moving, like whoever or whatever it was had no interest in being discovered. I'd crack a joke, but it didn't exactly feel like a time for humor. The noises stopped around midnight, just as abruptly as they'd started. I was relieved, chalking it up to paranoia or some animal passing through. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something strange. The rocks I'd left scattered around the fire pit were arranged in a neat little pile, stacked like some kind of primitive signal. My stomach tightened. Lou, usually calm as a stone, was on edge too, sniffing around like he'd picked up a scent that made him uneasy. Maybe it was a harmless prank. Or maybe not. Day 4 rolled around, and I figured I'd do a bit of exploring while there was still daylight. I packed up my gear, leaving my RV behind as I set out to find a nearby stream. After an hour or so of walking, I found a shallow creek, perfect for cooling off. I thought about taking a quick dip, but then I noticed something peculiar on the opposite bank. It was a pile of bones, all clean and white like they'd been picked dry. At first, I thought they were from an animal, a deer maybe, but then I saw what looked disturbingly like a human jawbone among the bones. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being followed. Each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt through me, making me turn around like a paranoid idiot. It didn't help that Lou had started acting jumpy, growling at nothing in particular, his hackles up. I'd laugh if it weren't so unsettling. I headed back to the RV as fast as I could without making it look like I was running. The whole forest felt different now, like it was hiding something or someone. I locked the RV door that night, pulled down all the blinds, and settled in with a flashlight and a bottle of whiskey, figuring I could sleep off the fear. But around midnight, I heard it again. Those footsteps. This time they were closer, circling the RV, deliberate and slow. My heart pounded so loud I was sure Lou could hear it. I peeked out of a small gap in the blinds, and what I saw nearly made me drop the flashlight. A man, pale and gaunt, was standing just a few yards away, his face turned toward the RV. He looked as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years, his skin almost translucent with dark patches like bruises on his arms and neck. He had something in his hand, a large hunting knife, which he was tapping against his thigh in a steady rhythm. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay still, hoping he'd go away if I didn't make a sound. But he didn't. He just kept standing there, staring at the RV like he could see through the walls. Then he started laughing, a low, humorless chuckle that made my skin crawl. Lou, bless his heart, stayed quiet but pressed against me, every muscle in his body tense. After what felt like hours, the man finally moved. He turned and walked back into the trees, leaving only his laughter echoing in the dark. I waited, every nerve in my body on high alert, but eventually I drifted off, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. The next morning, I checked outside. There were fresh boot prints all around the RV, along with deep gouges in the dirt where he had dragged the knife. The rocks from my fire pit were scattered again, only this time they were arranged in a shape I couldn't quite recognize, like some strange symbol. I knew I had to leave, but my RV wouldn't start. It had been running fine all week, but now it was as dead as a doornail. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. It was like someone or something wanted me to stay. Panic started setting in, but I knew I couldn't lose my cool. I grabbed a small hatchet I'd packed and decided I'd hike out of there if it came to it. Lou and I could cover a few miles to the nearest road. As I prepared to leave, I spotted something hanging from a nearby tree. It was a crude scarecrow made of sticks and what looked like animal fur, with a human skull perched on top. The jaw was missing, just like the one I'd seen by the creek. My gut twisted. This guy wasn't just out to scare me. He wanted to make sure I knew he was watching. Waiting. I didn't waste any more time. Lou and I headed down the trail, sticking close to the path, moving as fast as we could, but the feeling of being followed never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man standing there with his knife. After a few hours of walking, I heard a voice calling my name. It was low, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was close, too close. My heart was pounding like a drum, but I forced myself to keep moving. Lou was whimpering, pressing against my leg, clearly just as terrified. The voice kept calling, over and over, each time sounding a little closer. Then I saw him, standing on the trail ahead of us, grinning. His teeth were sharp, broken in places like he'd been gnawing on something hard. He raised his knife, pointing it at me like an invitation. "I'm going to find you, Roy," he said, his voice raspy and guttural. "Ain't no one coming to save you." I swung my hatchet, keeping him at bay, and backed away, my heart hammering. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, grinning like he enjoyed the fear in my eyes. Then he lunged, and I swung the hatchet hard, hearing a sickening crunch as it connected with his shoulder. He let out a low, guttural scream but didn't stop. He kept coming, even with blood pouring down his arm. I ran, pulling Lou with me, not looking back until we reached the edge of the clearing where the RV was parked. I could still hear his laughter echoing through the trees, fading as I reached the vehicle. Miraculously, the RV started up on the first try, as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was standing there, watching as I drove away. I floored it, heading straight for the nearest town, not stopping until I was miles away. When I finally reached a gas station, I stumbled out, barely able to speak. The attendant took one look at me and called the cops. A few hours later, after I'd calmed down enough to explain what happened, they sent out a search party. They didn't find him, just the remains of that makeshift scarecrow and the symbols etched into the dirt. They told me he was probably some local recluse, maybe a deranged survivalist who'd gone off the grid. But the look in their eyes told me they didn't believe that. Not really. Last I heard, they found another body near that campsite. A missing hiker who'd been out there a few months before. His jawbone was missing too. And every now and then, I hear rumors from other campers, stories about a pale man with a knife who calls their name out in the woods. I haven't been back to the Smokies since, and I don't plan to. My name's Elijah Grant, and this whole thing went down back in 2021 when I was camping out in Badlands National Park, South Dakota. I'd taken up solo RV trips as a way to clear my head after my divorce. Something about the quiet of the open land and rugged terrain helped me reset. I had my old 92 camper and enough coffee to last me a week. I'd parked just shy of the White River overlook for a few days' stay, surrounded by the stark, jagged rock formations that stretched as far as the eye could see. I was there for peace, solitude, and, if I was lucky, a little self-reflection. I'd come alone and didn't expect much company. By the third night, I was settled in for an early sleep after a long hike. I had my windows cracked just a bit for the breeze when I heard it, laughter. I mean, sure, people camp out here, but this was late, and it was strange. Not your usual campfire banter, but more like a mocking cackle that cut through the silence. I ignored it, figuring it was just some folks winding down from a long day, though the echo of that laughter felt out of place. About an hour later, I woke up again. The laughter was still there, but closer now. I squinted through the window, expecting to see a few headlamps in the distance, but there was nothing. Just that laugh echoing in the darkness. It didn't sound right, like someone was forcing themselves to sound amused, repeating the same tone over and over. I tried shaking it off as an animal call or even the wind playing tricks. The Badlands can mess with your head, after all. But when I stepped out of the camper for a quick look around, I found no one. Just endless, barren landscape under a half moon. A shiver ran through me, and I decided to lock up, double-checking every door before finally lying back down. I don't know how long I was asleep before a loud bang jarred me awake. The laughter was gone, replaced by a hard, rhythmic pounding against the side of my camper. Someone was slamming their fist, or something hard, right against the metal, and it wasn't stopping. Bam, bam, bam. Each hit was steady and relentless, like they were waiting to get a reaction. My heart pounded in my chest. I jumped up, peering through the window again. Nothing. I stayed frozen, listening, hoping it would just stop on its own. But it went on for what felt like forever, and then it stopped as abruptly as it had started. When the silence settled back in, I thought I might finally be able to get back to sleep, maybe chalk it all up to some odd wildlife behavior. But as I closed my eyes, a voice, low and almost mocking, whispered from right outside. "Bobby. Oh, Bobby." My blood turned to ice. I knew that voice. It was unmistakably mine, but distorted, twisted, like someone was mimicking me in a sick, eerie way. I jumped out of bed and turned on every light in the camper, standing there in a ridiculous daze, holding a flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. My own voice called out again from the darkness. "Bobby, come on out. We're having fun, aren't we?" I'd had enough. I grabbed my keys, planning to fire up the RV and leave no matter the hour. But when I turned to the driver's side, a shadow was blocking my view through the windshield. A large, bulky figure stood right in front of the camper, motionless. I squinted, trying to make out details, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw what he was wearing. A grinning mask, the kind kids wear for cheap Halloween scares, except this one had been twisted and smeared with red streaks across the mouth. The man tilted his head as if he were considering something, then took a slow, deliberate step toward the driver's door, reaching for the handle. I fumbled with the locks, making sure everything was secured, then backed away, scrambling to find my phone to call for help. But as I raised the phone, the signal dropped and I was left with nothing but an empty line. There was no service out here, not that deep in the Badlands. I was on my own. The banging started again, this time on the back window, then the sides. Whoever was out there had help, at least 2 or 3 people, all pounding on the camper from every angle. It was a coordinated attack, each thud coming in sync like they were performing some twisted ritual. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew they were playing with me, getting a sick thrill from my fear. I crouched low, my back pressed against the door as I scanned my surroundings for anything I could use as a weapon. There was a heavy wrench in the toolbox under the sink, and I gripped it like it was my lifeline. Then a voice, faint but clear, filtered through the thin walls. It was the same distorted mimicry, repeating in my own voice. "Bobby, you can't hide forever. Come out and play." I was sweating, clutching that wrench with every ounce of strength I had. The banging stopped, and silence filled the air. I strained to listen, half hoping they'd left. But then a soft scraping started at the back window. It was a knife, dragging, scratching, just to let me know they could get in if they wanted to. It felt like hours passed with nothing but that slow, taunting scrape filling the air. Finally, I heard footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. But I didn't dare move. I waited, huddled in the dark for what felt like an eternity until the sun began to rise, spilling light over the Badlands. The pounding was gone. But as I stepped outside, I saw something on the ground near my camper, a torn piece of cloth, and smeared on the door was a single handprint, red and sticky. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just a prank, but that handprint told me otherwise. I decided to pack up and head to the nearest ranger station to report what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me as I drove down the desolate, winding road back toward civilization. When I finally reached the ranger station, I told the park rangers everything. One of them, an older man with a hardened expression, just nodded, but he didn't look surprised. "You're not the first," he said. "Every now and then, campers report strange things out there, things they can't explain." He went on to tell me about a man who used to roam the Badlands years ago, an escapee from some psychiatric facility nearby. They'd never caught him, but people said he had a habit of showing up in campsites, mimicking voices, playing with his prey before vanishing into the night. "Maybe he's just a myth," the ranger said, "but a lot of folks have seen things they can't explain. If I were you, I'd stick to more populated areas." As I left the station, the ranger's words stuck with me, and later, when I returned to my camper to finally inspect the red handprint, I realized it wasn't paint. The smell was unmistakable. With my last glance back at the Badlands, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, he was still watching, still waiting for the next camper, unlucky enough to stumble into his territory. I spent weeks getting my RV ready for this trip, up to North Dakota. Always wanted to check out Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Heard nothing but good things about the place, and being a history buff, figured it was the perfect fall escape for me. I'm low, by the way, Arlo Finnegan, a little bit of a loner, but what can I say? I like having all this space in the RV to myself. Makes me feel like a modern-day nomad, even without a horse. First couple of days were all good, hiked around, saw some seriously impressive bison. It's like the Wild West never disappeared out here. You know, that evening. I made a fire grilled, the worst steak of my life. Note to self, learn how to cook before the next road trip, and finally settled in with a book for the night. Now that's peace. Everything changed on the third day. I was way out in the south unit of the park. So this trail that supposedly was meant for experienced hikers thing I'm experienced, like I've climbed some pretty gnarly routes out in Oregon. This wasn't even a challenge until it was, somewhere along the way must have lost track of the marked path. Daylight was starting to wane through the trees, which wouldn't have bothered me so much. If I weren't already spooked, it's hard to explain. It was just this feeling, a prickle on my skin, like something was watching me, but I couldn't see what that thought stuck. I slowed down, scanning the trees. It had to be a deer or something, right? I even called out a couple of times, you know, the usual, "Hey, bear" stuff. Not that I thought it was a bear, but hey, sometimes making noise is enough to scare smaller critters off. Nothing, not a damn thing. I decided to keep walking, figured I'd looped back to the RV. Sooner or later, then I heard it faint at first, like a shuffling, maybe branches rustling in the wind, but something about it felt wrong. I turned, heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the first indentations in the ground, huge marks too wide for any boots I'd ever seen. A chill ran through me. I don't scare easy, but some primal part of me just knew this wasn't right. Whatever made those marks wasn't meant to be seen. Now, I should have turned and run right then, in there, call it intuition or whatever you want, but I'd let the fear settle and something else replaced it. Morbid curiosity. I guess stupid in hindsight, yeah, but we've all done dumb things in the heat of the moment. Besides, who'd believe me if I told them I got chased off by Bigfoot or some other cryptid, right? I started following the tracks. They weren't as crisp as I'd like, not on the tough ground, but clear enough, huge strides way too far apart for any normal person. As I got deeper in following this invisible trail, the setting sun painted those woods in reds and oranges, making everything look a hell of a lot less friendly. The tracks led me to this small clearing. That's when I heard the snap like a heavy branch breaking under something big. I spun, holding my breath. That's when I saw it now. I'm no good with descriptions, but I'll try. It stood in the half-light, hunched over, a bit massive, even from this distance. Like a person that had been stretched and distorted, all wrong angles, and two long limbs, fur or something like fur, covered it. Not brown or black, but a weird shifting gray, like shadows, but the face. That's what sticks with me. God, the face. No features to speak. Speak of not really just two pits where eyes should be, and a mouth that shouldn't be able to stretch that wide, too many teeth in there. All needle sharp, the whole thing. It wasn't right, unnatural, like it was breaking the rules of how things should look. We locked our eyes, or at least I think we did, hard to tell with whatever that thing had going on. It tilted its head, almost curious. That primal fear kicked in, and I took gorking. Off running back the way I'd come, not even thinking about the damn tracks. Any more branches? Whipped at my face. I tripped, tumbled, swearing at myself. The whole way didn't matter. If I made noise, the thing was close. I could hear its heavy footsteps pounding after me. Crashing through the underbrush, I burst out of the trees back onto a real trail, and I swear, I saw the RV just ahead, a beacon of hope, except something caught my leg, a branch, or maybe a low-hanging vine, but it felt strong, too strong, and it hauled me down. I hit the ground with a grunt and scrabbled to my feet, but too late. The thing was already there, towering over me. It made this awful sound, a wet gurgle that seemed to come from everywhere. At once I screamed, and then I grabbed a fallen branch and swung fast. I'm not a fighter by nature, but adrenaline does crazy things to you. I caught the thing in its side. It gave a startled bellow, and that bought me just enough time to scramble up the path. Damn, why hadn't I noticed how overgrown it was earlier? I barreled down at heart in my throat, that gurgling growl echoing behind me. My lungs burned, but I had to get to my RV. I had a flare gun in there somewhere, and maybe it might scare this thing off. I saw the RV up ahead, a blessed square of metal against the encroaching night, but just as I thought I was in the clear, I ran into something solid. It didn't give like a tree trunk. Would terror made me look up just as the hand closed around my throat. I don't know how to describe it, like bone, but wet and cold, so damn cold. Huge endless fingers wrapped around me, lifting me clean off the ground. I kicked and struggled, but its grip was like a steel vise. I could feel its breath on. My face felt like something rotten, and those pits, they glowed faintly, now burning into me. And I knew it was taking its time, savoring this. Then a voice cut through the darkness. A woman, sharp and scared, get away from him. I heard a bang, a roar, and the fingers loosened. I dropped to the ground, coughing, scrambling back. The creature was lunging towards the source of the noise. I fumbled for my lighter, praying. It was in my pocket, click flame. I jammed the lighter right up under the thing's chin, the whoosh of fire catching on its fur. It shrieked a terrible piercing sound that rattled in my bones and staggered back. The woman yelled again, another gunshot echoing through the trees. That flicker of light seemed to break some spell. I was running again towards the RV, my keys clattered to the ground as I fumbled with the lock, but bless all the safety drills I'd ever ignored. The door swung open and I tumbled in, slamming it shut behind me. I could hear the creature pounding against the metal, roaring in rage. I locked the door, then the deadbolt for good measure. My heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against my ribs, slumping to the floor, hand shaking. I fumbled for my phone, no service of freaking course. The window beside me shattered, and that odd hand reached through, groping blindly. I scrambled away, scrabbling for something, anything there, the flare gun. I grabbed it and aimed it through the broken window. With a trembling hand, I pulled the trigger. A blinding burst of red, and the thing howled its hand, recoiling from the flare's burn. I took the chance, stumbling over to the driver's seat and turning the key. The coughed, then roared to life. I slammed the RV into reverse, praying this hulking beast wasn't about to overturn my ride. The woman was out there, still firing. "Sasha, get in," she yelled. Sasha. That was her name. But how I didn't have time to think, she was already sprinting towards the RV gun, clutched in one hand, a split second before she dove in the passenger's side. I hit the pedal, nearly throwing her clear across the seats. I floored it, swerving wildly as more thuds and screeches came from behind. The thing was trying to chase us down my stomach, churned, fear and adrenaline twisting in some terrible tango. We bounced down that overgrown path, headlights slashing through the trees. Sasha swore, "Hang on, I think there's a turn up here. Might get us to the main road." We swerved branches, scraping the sides of the RV, but I trusted her, and there it was, blessed asphalt and the faintest hint of other headlights in the distance. I poured every bit of power into the RV. The thing gaining on us. Sasha kept firing out the window, those echoing gunshots barely keeping it at bay. "I don't have many left," she choked out. We hit the main road and I gunned forward, weaving around slower cars. People honked, flashing their brights, totally oblivious to the monster in the woods. "Police station," Sasha gasped, pointing towards a blur of lights in the distance, couple miles, maybe less. The creature was a dark mass at the edge of the road, falling behind, but not giving up. The police station came into view and I slammed the brakes, screeching into the parking lot. We burst out of the RV, not even bothering, with the doors running, for the entrance. "Help," Sasha screamed. "Help us." An officer appeared, gun drawn, expression shifting from confused to alarmed. More officers followed, and suddenly the night exploded with noise, and flashing lights. I ducked behind a squad car, hearts still rattling against my ribs as they fired into the darkness. The creature finally retreated back into the night, its roars fading as it vanished into the trees. It took hours to explain everything, at least everything. I could remember the cops swore there had been no reports of an animal like that, but they seemed to take Sasha's words seriously. She was military. She said on leave from a special operations unit down in Texas on a camping trip. She'd heard the gunshots track them back here. They found the clearing, the massive footprints, the signs of a struggle, but nothing of the creature itself. It had disappeared without a trace. No one believed most of my story. Of course, trauma shock. They tossed out the usual explanation, but Sasha, she believed me. We exchanged numbers, promised to stay in touch. I even learned a bit about her unit. What they specialized in, turns out, there's more out there lurking in the shadows than most folks realized. The next few days were a blur of paperwork interviews, and a long drive back home took forever to scrub the blood out of the RV's carpet, but I managed. I sold the thing shortly after. I don't think I'll be doing any more solo road trips for a while, sometimes at night. I still hear that terrible, wet gurgle echoing in the empty spaces of my apartment, or I'll see a shadow move too quickly. At the edge of my vision and flinch, I'll probably never stop. Looking over my shoulder, wondering if the next set of eyes in the dark will be those empty, glowing pits the locals started, calling it the Shadow Walker, at least the ones daring enough to even talk about it. But to me, it'll always be something else, something more primal. The Eater in the dark. My name is Liam Clinton, and I'm 40 years old. This happened last fall at Spruce Knob, the highest peak in West Virginia. I had just finalized my divorce, packed up my life, and hit the road in an RV that still smells like the dealership. I told myself this trip was about reconnecting with nature, about finding some clarity, but really, I was running from guilt, loneliness, and the wreckage of a life I'd built and then broken. I chose Spruce Knob because it was isolated, and isolation was exactly what I thought I needed. I didn't know the stories. I didn't know about the Devil's Rock. If I had, I'd like to think I would have turned back, but honestly, I don't know if I could have resisted. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun slipping behind the ridge as I parked my RV at a campsite near the summit. The forest here was dense, the spruce trees standing like sentinels in the fading light. I set up a small fire and sat by it, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. That's when I met Eli. He was the kind of man who looked like he belonged in the mountains, tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered like an old oak tree. I'd stopped by the trailhead earlier to get a map, and he must have noticed the out-of-state plates on my RV, because he wandered over to introduce himself. "You're new around here," he said, his voice gravely but not unkind. "Just passing through," I replied. We talked for a while, mostly about the trails and the weather. Then, as if it were an afterthought, Eli asked, "You hear about the Devil's Rock yet?" I shook my head, curious despite myself. "It's an old legend," he said, leaning against a tree. "There's a boulder deep in the woods, smooth as glass. They say folks claim if you touch it, you can make a wish, but it always comes at a price." I laughed nervously. "And what's the price?" Eli's eyes darkened. "Depends. Sometimes it's your sanity, sometimes it's worse." I tried to brush it off as campfire talk, but his tone stayed with me long after he walked away. The first night was uneventful, but strange things started happening. The next day, I set out on one of the trails Eli had recommended, hoping to clear my head and maybe snap a few photos. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt. That's when I noticed the trail veering off to the right, unmarked and overgrown. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to follow it. The path twisted through the trees, narrowing until I reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive boulder, smooth and black, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light. Dead trees surrounded it, their branches bare and skeletal. I didn't stay long. There was something about the place that made my skin crawl. That night, the tapping started. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the side of the RV. I froze, my heart pounding. It sounded like someone or something was knocking, but when I finally mustered the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found small handprints in the dirt outside the RV. They were faint but unmistakable, as if left by a child. I shook it off as my imagination, but later that day, I saw her. She was standing just off the trail, a teenage girl with pale skin and long dark hair. She wore a tattered dress that looked like something out of a history book, and her eyes were wide and pleading. "Are you lost?" I called out. She nodded but didn't speak. I stepped toward her, but before I could get close, she turned and darted into the woods. I chased after her, shouting for her to wait, but she disappeared, leaving no trace but a trail of faint footprints leading toward the clearing. When I returned to the RV, the unease I'd been feeling turned into something darker. I couldn't shake the girl's image from my mind, her hollow eyes and the way she seemed to vanish into thin air. That night, I dreamed about the Devil's Rock. In the dream, the girl was sitting on the boulder, her hands resting on its smooth surface. Her voice was soft but insistent. "It can give you what you want." When I woke, I couldn't get her words out of my head. The next morning, I decided to find the boulder again. Again, I don't know what I was expecting. Answers, maybe, or closure. The unmarked trail was easier to find this time, as if it had been waiting for me. The clearing was just as I remembered it, the boulder looming in the center like some ancient monolith. The air was heavy, the kind of heaviness that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. And then she appeared. The girl stood on the far side of the boulder, her expression vacant. She raised a hand, motioning for me to come closer. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she placed her hand on the boulder and whispered, "It can give you what you want." I hesitated, my heart pounding. The memory of my family, the laughter of my kids, the warmth of my ex-wife's smile flooded my mind. I hadn't seen them in months, and the thought of a second chance was intoxicating. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched the rock. At first, nothing happened. I felt a faint vibration beneath my fingers, but that was all. Disappointed, I returned to the RV, trying to convince myself it had been a foolish impulse. But that evening, my phone rang. It was my ex-wife. "I've been thinking about us," she said, her voice tentative. "Maybe we should talk." The weight in my chest lifted, replaced by a flicker of hope. I thought the rock had worked, that I'd been given a miracle. But the miracle came with a price. That night, the girl returned. She appeared outside the RV, her face pressed against the window. Her eyes were no longer pleading. They were dark, empty voids that seemed to suck the air from the room. "You made your wish," she whispered. "Now it's time to pay." The lights in the RV flickered, and the shadows inside began to twist and rise. I grabbed a flashlight and stumbled outside, shouting into the darkness, "What do you want from me?" Her voice came from everywhere at once. "It's not me. It's the rock." Desperate, I raced back to the clearing. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around me as I ran. When I reached the boulder, it seemed larger, its surface pulsing like a living thing. The girl appeared again, her form shifting and flickering like a glitch in a video. "You can't undo it," she said, her voice echoing, "but you can stop it from taking more." I grabbed a hammer from my pack and swung it at the boulder. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, and the girl screamed, her voice merging with the sound of the rock cracking. The boulder split down the middle, a deafening roar echoing through the forest. The girl collapsed, her form dissolving into mist as the air grew still. When I woke the next morning, the clearing was empty. The boulder was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble. I returned to the RV and called my ex-wife, apologizing for everything. Whatever chance we had at reconciliation, I knew it had to come from me, not from some cursed rock. As I drove away from Spruce Knob, I caught a glimpse of the girl in my rearview mirror, standing among the trees. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't angry either. She was just watching. Sometimes the things we want most come at a price too steep to pay, and sometimes we have to let go to move forward. My name is Nolan Prescott, and back in 2017, I took my RV to the remote stretches of the UK territory in Canada. I've always found solace in the wilderness, a break from the buzz of city life after years of crunching numbers as an accountant. The open road and towering pines felt like a breath of fresh air. I set off early one morning, the sun casting a golden hue over the rugged landscape. The plan was simple: drive until I found a spot that spoke to me, set up camp, and lose myself in a good book. The Yukon was vast, and solitude came easy by midday. I stumbled upon a clearing beside a crystal-clear lake. The water was so still it mirrored the sky perfectly, a photographer's dream. After parking the RV, I decided to explore the surroundings. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine, and earth birds chirped intermittently, and the occasional rustle hinted at small creatures going about their day. I chuckled to myself, thinking this was the kind of place where people claim to find themselves. A few hours into my hike, I noticed something peculiar. The forest grew eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. I brushed it off as the natural stillness of the wilderness and pressed on, but then I saw it, a dilapidated cabin nestled between the trees. Almost camouflaged by the overgrowth, curiosity piqued. I approached the cabin. The wood was rotten and the windows were shattered. It didn't look like anyone had been there for years. Pushing the creaky door open, I stepped inside. The interior was sparse, just a table. A chair and a rusted stove on the table lay a notebook, its pages yellowed with age, flipping. Through, I realized it was a journal entries, dated back decades, detailing hunting trips and the harshness of surviving in the wild. One name kept appearing: C. The last entry was abrupt. The voices are louder now, they won't. Let me leave. A shiver ran down my spine. Dark humor kicked in as I thought. Great. I've walked into a cliché horror movie setting. I left the cabin, eager to return to the RV. The sun was dipping low and navigating the forest in the dark. Wasn't on my agenda as I retraced my steps. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. But when I turned, there was nothing back at the RV. I locked the doors and settled in for the night. The wind picked up, causing branches to tap against the vehicle. It was unsettling, but nothing I couldn't handle. I made myself a cup of instant coffee and tried to read, but my mind kept wandering back to the journal and its ominous final words. Sleep came fitfully around midnight. A loud thud jolted me awake. I sat up, heart pounding, listening intently. I heard footsteps. Circling the RV, probably just a bear, I whispered to myself, though I wasn't entirely convinced, reaching into the drawer beside me. I realized I hadn't packed my usual camping knife. Fantastic, I muttered. Of all the times to forget, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, then a scratching sound at the door. I mustered up some courage and called out, "Whose?" Their silence gathering what little bravado I had. I peeked through the window in the dim glow of the moon. I saw a figure standing a few yards away, tall, gaunt, and motionless. "Can I help you?" I shouted. No response. The figure tilted its head as if contemplating me. I decided staying inside was the best course of action. Grabbing a flashlight, I shone it toward the figure. The beam illuminated a man with a wild beard, clothes tattered and stained. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. "Look, if you need help, I can call someone," I offered, trying to sound calm. He took a step forward, revealing a bloodied axe in his hand. Panic surged through me. This was no lost hiker. I scrambled to start the RV's engine. The old vehicle sputtered, but didn't turn over. "Not now, come on," I pleaded, turning the key frantically. The man began pounding on the door, the metal denting with each strike. Desperate. I remembered the flare gun in the emergency kit. Grabbing the door. I pointed it at the door, hands shaking. The pounding stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air. Then, without warning, the rear window shattered. I spun around to see his arm reaching in, trying to unlock the door. Without thinking, I fired the flare gun. The bright light shot past his arm, igniting the curtain flames quickly. Spread and smoke filled the RV. Coughing, I knew I had to get out. I kicked open the side door and dashed into the night. The cold air hit me like a wall, but adrenaline kept me moving behind me. The RV was engulfed in flames, illuminating the area. I could hear his footsteps chasing after me. The forest was a maze of shadows and obstacles. Branches whipped against my face. As I sprinted, blind lie ahead, I spotted a narrow ravine without hesitation. I slid down the incline, hoping it would slow him down at the bottom. I hid behind a large boulder, trying to catch my breath. The sounds of pursuit grew distant. Maybe I'd lost him. Just as I allowed myself a sliver of hope, a voice echoed through the trees. "You can't hide forever, friend." His tone was mocking, almost playful. I needed a plan. Scanning surroundings, I noticed a fallen tree, limb, sturdy and sharp. At one end, it wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, gripping it tightly. I prepared myself. If he found me, I wouldn't go down without a fight. Minutes felt like hours. The only sounds were the crackling of the burning RV and my own ragged breaths. Then footsteps above the ravine. He was close. "Why make this difficult?" he called out. "It's been so long since I've had company." As he descended into the ravine, his silhouette became visible against the glow of the distant fire. I held my breath, muscles tense, when he was a mere few feet away. I lunged, driving the sharp end of the limb towards him. He reacted swiftly, dodging just enough to avoid a fatal blow, but the makeshift spear grazed his shoulder. He let out a grunt, more annoyed than hurt. "Feisty one, aren't you?" He swung the axe, and I barely dodged, feeling the whoosh of air as it passed by. We circled each other, the narrow space forcing us into close quarters combat. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, hoping to distract him. He chuckled. "Darkly, solitude gets lonely. Got to have some fun now and then." He charged at me, and we grappled up close. The stench of decay on him was overpowering. I struggled to keep the axe at bay, using all my strength. I managed to twist his wrist, causing him to drop the weapon, seizing the opportunity. I kicked him back and grabbed the axe, now armed. I pointed it at him. "Stay back." He raised his hands mockingly. "What now? You think you have the guts?" I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran further down the ravine, the weight of the axe slowing me, but offering a sense of security. Behind me, his laughter echoed eerily. Run as fast as you can." The terrain became treacherous, rocks slick with moss. In my haste, I slipped, tumbling down a slope and landing hard. Pain shot through my ankle. Trying to stand, I realized it was sprained. If not broken, looks like the chase is over. His voice floated from above. I crawled, dragging myself towards a crevice in the rock face. Squeezing into the narrow space, I held my breath. He appeared at the top of the slope, scanning the area. Come out wherever you are." Minutes passed as he searched. The forest seemed to conspire with him, every rustle betraying my hiding spot. Just when I thought he might move on, He started descending carefully. Each step calculated, desperation took hold. I felt around the crevice and found small stones. It wasn't much, but perhaps it could buy me some time as he neared. I threw a stone in the opposite direction. It clattered loudly. He snapped his head towards the noise. Clever, but not clever enough. He continued towards me as he approached the crevice. I gripped the axe tightly the moment he was within reach. I swung with all my might. The blade caught him off guard, slicing into his leg. He screamed in agony, stumbling back, seizing the moment. I emerged from the crevice and struck again, this time aiming for his shoulder. The axe embedded deep, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping. I hobbled away, pain searing through my ankle. The adrenaline was fading and exhaustion set in, but I couldn't stop. I had to find help after what felt like hours. The forest thinned, and I stumbled upon a dirt road. Headlights appeared in the distance, waving frantically. I collapsed as the vehicle approached. A couple jumped out. Rushing to my aid, "What happened to you?" the woman asked, concern etched on her face. "There's a man, he tried to kill me," I managed to say between labored breaths. They exchanged worried glances. "Latun, get you to a hospital," the man said as they helped me into their truck. I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. "Did you see anyone else on the road?" I asked. The man shook his head. "No one. This area is pretty isolated. At the hospital, authorities were notified." I recounted everything to the police. A search party was dispatched to the location I described. 2 days later, an officer visited me. "We found the cabin in signs of a struggle," he said, grimly. There were also remains, several bodies buried nearby. "Did you find him?" I asked. He nodded. "We did. His name was Silas Kane, used to be a hunter out here, went missing years ago after reportedly losing his mind. You're lucky to be alive. Silas Kane, the name from the journal. It all clicked into place. What happens now with him deceased? We can only close old cases and notify families." The officer replied, "You did what you had to do." I left the Yukon shortly after, the vast wilderness no longer holding the same allure. The open road was replaced by the comfort of city streets and the company of others. In the end, it was a grim reminder that sometimes the real dangers aren't the beasts of the forest, but the mon-ears within men. My name is James Nelson, and I'm 40 years old. This happened last summer while I was investigating a viral ghost story at Devil's Backbone in West Virginia. I've spent years debunking hauntings, cryptid sightings, and so-called cursed places. It's what I do for a living, exposing frauds and hoaxes on my YouTube channel, Reality Bites. I never expected Devil's Backbone to be any different. I was wrong. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, the sunlight painting the jagged cliffs of the ridge in deep orange hues. Devil's Backbone stretched before me, an imposing line of rocky outcroppings and dense forest. The campground was deserted. Just me, my RV, and a few empty fire pits surrounded by overgrown weeds. Perfect for filming. I set up my equipment, cameras, microphones, a drone for aerial shots. I like to have all the angles covered, even if I expected nothing more than crickets and wind. The legend that brought me here was as ridiculous as they come. A group of hikers claimed they'd heard chanting and seen glowing symbols near the ridge. The story had racked up millions of views online, and I figured a straightforward debunking would bring in decent traffic. But something about the ridge unsettled me. It wasn't just the isolation. The cliffs had a presence, like they were watching, waiting. After setting up camp, I hiked up to the ridge for some preliminary footage. The trail was steep and narrow, winding through a forest of twisted, ancient trees. Their gnarled branches formed a canopy that filtered the sunlight into eerie, shifting patterns. About halfway up, I spotted the first symbol. It was carved into the rock, jagged and precise. At first, I thought it was graffiti, but it didn't look modern. No spray paint or amateur scribbles. It was intricate, like something you'd see in a textbook on ancient languages. I snapped a photo and moved on, telling myself it was probably just a prank. As I climbed higher, I started to hear faint humming. It wasn't wind or birds. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting. I paused, holding my breath to listen, but it stopped the moment I tried to pinpoint its direction. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest below. I launched my drone, hoping to capture the cliffs from above. The drone whirred into the sky, its camera sending back clear, steady footage of the ridge and surrounding woods. Then, without warning, the feed cut out. I stared at the screen, confused. The drone was still airborne, but its signal was gone. Moments later, it plummeted out of the sky, crashing somewhere in the trees. Frustrated, I made a note to retrieve it in the morning and headed back to camp. As darkness fell, the first few hours of night were uneventful. I sat inside my RV, editing the day's footage and making notes for the next day. Around midnight, I stepped outside to check the cameras I had placed around the site. That's when I saw the lights. They flickered along the ridge, moving slowly, like lanterns swaying in the wind. I grabbed my binoculars and focused in. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. A figure stood on the edge of the cliff. It was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct, but it was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite my best effort to stay calm. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed directly at me. I backed into the RV, slamming the door shut. My hands shook as I locked it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or maybe another camper playing a prank. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found scratches on the RV's exterior. They were deep, parallel grooves, like claw marks running along the side of the vehicle. My stomach churned. I checked my cameras, but the footage was corrupted, static and flickers of distorted images. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I hiked back up the ridge. This time, the symbols were everywhere. They were carved into trees, etched into rocks, even scratched into the dirt. The humming started again, louder and more persistent. I reached the crash site of my drone, but it wasn't there. Instead, I found a backpack. It was torn open, its contents scattered, a water bottle, a map, a trail guide. There was no sign of its owner. As I examined the scene, I felt the air grow colder. A shadow passed over me, and I turned to see the figure from the night before, standing just a few feet away. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its face shrouded in darkness, except for its eyes, glowing like embers. I ran. Back at camp, I tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The figure appeared again, standing at the edge of the clearing. This time, it stepped closer. "Why are you here?" a voice hissed, low and guttural. I froze, my mind racing. I thought about Vanessa Davis, the historian I'd spoken to before coming here. She'd warned me about the site's history, that a coven of witches had been executed here centuries ago, accused of summoning spirits to protect their land. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll leave. Just let me go." The figure tilted its head as if considering my words. Then it raised a hand, and the symbols around the campsite began to glow, forming a circle of light that trapped me inside. The voice returned, louder this time. "You seek truth where none is welcome. Leave this place or be consumed by it." Desperate, I searched my gear for anything I could use. I found a small bag of salt, an old trick I'd learned for warding off supposed spirits. I poured it around the RV, forming a crude barrier. The figure screamed, a sound that shook the ground beneath me. It lunged at the barrier, but couldn't cross it. "Stay away," I shouted, holding up the salt bag like a shield. The figure retreated, its glowing eyes fixed on me as it faded into the trees. By dawn, the symbols had disappeared and the RV's engine started without issue. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. When I reviewed the footage later, most of it was unusable, blurry, distorted, filled with static. But one clip stood out. It showed the figure standing on the ridge, its glowing eyes staring directly into the camera. I uploaded the video to my channel, knowing it would be dismissed as a hoax. That was fine by me. Some truths aren't meant to be explained. It all began with a bad decision, as these things always do. I should have stuck to the main trails in Gila National Forest, but something about the allure of Devil's Pass was too irresistible. The name itself, Devil's Pass, was a warning, but I ignored it. The idea of capturing something unique for my nature photography portfolio was too tempting to pass up. Meeting Sam and Kelly at the ranger station felt like fate, or perhaps it was my growing discomfort with the thought of venturing into such an isolated place alone. Sam was the kind of man who radiated overconfidence, bordering on arrogance. His wiry frame and grizzled beard suggested he'd seen far too much of the world, and survived it. Kelly, his wife, was the opposite. Quiet, reserved, and though she said little, I could sense the deep resentment in her eyes. She'd likely been dragged on too many of these wild adventures, each one wearing her down further. "You're heading to Devil's Pass?" Sam asked as I studied the trail map. "We're going there too. You should join us. It's safer in numbers." I hesitated. Safety wasn't my concern. I liked the solitude, but something about his insistence unsettled me, so I agreed. The trailhead was more treacherous than I had expected. After barely a mile, Kelly's boots started falling apart. "Damn, things are falling apart," she muttered, holding up her boot to reveal the sole peeling away. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, but Sam scoffed. "She's fine," he said, his voice dismissive. "We'll patch it up." I handed over a roll of duct tape, and Sam wrapped it around her boot. She gave a weak smile. "Thanks. Guess I should have invested in better gear." We continued, but the atmosphere turned grim. Kelly limped behind while Sam barked at her to keep up. The trail became harder to follow, the markers disappearing into the thickening forest. An unsettling, acrid smell lingered in the air, clinging to the coolness around us. "You sure we're going the right way?" I asked, noticing how the map no longer seemed to match the terrain. Sam waved me off. "This is it. Just a little farther and we'll hit the ridge." We reached the ridge just as the sun began to set. The view was breathtaking, the jagged cliffs bathed in golden light like something out of a dream. I snapped a few photos while Sam set up camp near a cluster of bizarre rock formations. The stones were covered in petroglyphs, but these weren't the simple ancient symbols I was used to. They were wrong. "That's unsettling," Kelly murmured, tracing a finger over one that resembled a humanoid figure with elongated limbs and antlers. "It's just art," Sam said dismissively. "Ancient graffiti." But the figures felt alive, staring, watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow waiting. That night, I woke to a sound I couldn't place, a soft, whispering voice on the wind. "Jenna." I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I sat up, scanning the campsite. The others were still asleep. The voice came again, closer this time. "Jenna, come here." My breath hitched. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam into the trees, but there was nothing, just shadows, twisting in the pale moonlight. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, shaking Kelly awake. "What?" she mumbled, her eyes bleary with sleep. "A voice," I said, my voice trembling. "Someone's out there." She listened for a moment, then shook her head. "It's just the wind. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake it. Something wasn't right. We weren't alone. The next day, we pressed deeper into the pass. The forest grew darker, the trees closing in around us like sentinels. Kelly found another set of petroglyphs, these even more disturbing than the last. One depicted a figure standing over a pile of bones, its antlered head twisted toward the viewer. "Let's keep moving," Sam said, his voice tight. The acrid smell from the night before grew stronger, stinging my nostrils. And then we found it, the altar. A crude stone slab covered in animal bones and ash. In the center, a blackened mass sat, its shape grotesque and unrecognizable, but unmistakably nauseating. "Oh my God," Kelly whispered, backing away. "What is this?" Sam stepped closer, examining the remains with morbid curiosity. "Probably some kind of offering ritual. Old stuff." "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, a rustling came from the bushes. We froze. Eyes darting to the tree line, we saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows. Tall, emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head was a deer's skull, but its antlers were twisted, serpentine. Glowing red eyes locked onto us. "Run," I whispered, but no one moved. The creature stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Go," I screamed. Finally, we snapped out of our trance and bolted. Branches snapped underfoot as we ran, desperate, the heavy sound of the creature's footsteps behind us. Kelly tripped and fell, but Sam yanked her to her feet, and we didn't stop until we reached our campsite, gasping for air. The fire had gone out. The RV stood eerily silent, untouched, but something was wrong. Something was off. "We're leaving," I said, fumbling with the keys. "No," Sam said, his voice firm. "We can't. If we try to drive now, we'll get lost." "Better lost than dead," I snapped, but he shook his head. Then Kelly grabbed my arm. "Wait, do you hear that?" It was Kelly's voice, but it was coming from the trees. "Help me," the voice called, perfectly mimicking her tone. "That's not me," she said, her face draining of color. Sam grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the tree line. "Don't!" I warned, but he ignored me. He shone the beam into the darkness. Nothing. The voice called again, this time from the opposite direction. "It's playing with us," Kelly whispered. The RV began to rock violently as if something massive was pushing it from side to side. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the door open and screamed for the others to get inside. We huddled inside, locking the doors, but the rocking didn't stop. The creature's voice came again. My voice. "Come out, Jenna. It's safe." Kelly broke down, sobbing into her hands. Sam sat silently, gripping a hunting knife he hadn't bothered to use earlier. I rifled through the emergency kit, pulling out a flare gun. "What are you doing?" Sam asked. "I'm ending this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I opened the door and stepped outside, the flare gun trembling in my hand. The creature was waiting at the edge of the clearing, its glowing red eyes gleaming. "Come closer," it said, its voice perfect, mimicking my own. I aimed the flare gun and fired. The flare struck the creature square in the chest, igniting it in a burst of blinding red light. It screamed, but the sound was like 1,000 voices crying in agony. Then it vanished into the darkness. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Sam floored the gas pedal, driving us away from the pass as fast as the RV would go. No one spoke until we reached the ranger station. Even then, we said nothing about what we'd seen. A week later, I uploaded my photos, hoping to salvage something from the trip. That's when I saw it, a picture I didn't remember taking. In the background, the creature stood directly behind me, its glowing eyes locked onto the camera. I haven't been back to the wilderness since. My name is Elijah Allen. I'm 25 years old, and this happened just last fall in the wilderness of Spruce Knob, West Virginia. I was there with my brother Mark, his girlfriend Emily, and his best friend Ryan. We had planned a week-long camping trip, a much-needed break from the grind of everyday life. Instead, it became a nightmare I can barely talk about even now. It started as a simple idea. Mark, 28, was always the adventurous one, the kind of guy who thought following a marked trail was too easy. I went along because I needed to document local flora and fauna for my thesis in biology. Emily, 27, joined to spend more time with Mark and indulge her love of spooky campfire stories. Then there was Ryan, 26, clumsy and lovable, eager to make memories away from his desk job. Together we made an odd group, but we figured we'd have fun. We parked the RV at the Whispering Pines trailhead and set off into the dense, ancient forest. The air smelled of moss and pine, and sunlight dappled the ground through the canopy. Spruce Knob, the highest peak in West Virginia, loomed in the distance. Mark insisted we take an unmarked route he'd found on an old map, and despite my reservations, we followed him deeper into the woods. The first 2 days were relatively uneventful, apart from Ryan's usual mishaps. He forgot a tent pole, forcing us to patch his tent with duct tape. One of our flashlights inexplicably died, even though we had checked all the batteries beforehand. Small annoyances, but nothing we couldn't handle. It was the second night when things began to feel off. We had set up camp near a clearing surrounded by spruce trees. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced on the surrounding trunks. Emily had just finished telling a story about the children of the forest, ghostly figures said to lure hikers to their deaths. Mark groaned and threw a pine cone at her. "Enough of that nonsense," he said. "You're going to scare Ryan." Ryan, to his credit, laughed nervously but didn't respond. That's when I noticed the quiet. The usual nighttime symphony of crickets and distant owls had stopped completely. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mark smirked. "I don't hear anything." "That's the point," I said. "Peace and quiet." "No," Emily said, her voice tight. "He's right. It's too quiet." Mark rolled his eyes and poked the fire. "You two are just looking for something to be scared about." I decided to let it go, but a gnawing unease crept into my chest. That night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps circling the tents, deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding. "Jesse," a voice whispered. It sounded like Mark. I unzipped my tent slowly, peeking out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow. Just beyond the light, I saw Mark's silhouette standing by the trees. "What are you doing?" I hissed. He didn't respond. "Mark?" The figure turned and walked into the woods. My first thought was that he was sleepwalking. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out and followed. But when I reached the spot where I'd seen him, he was gone. There were no footsteps in the dirt. When I got back to the tents, Mark was snoring loudly inside his. The next morning, I told the group what I'd seen. Mark laughed it off. "You were dreaming," he said. "Too many ghost stories from Emily." "I wasn't dreaming," I snapped. "I know what I saw." Ryan looked uneasy, but didn't say anything. Emily just stared at the ground. We packed up and continued hiking, but the atmosphere had changed. Mark's confidence began to grate on me. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, and Ryan's usual jokes dried up. Around midday, we stumbled upon something strange, a set of tracks in the dirt. They looked human, but larger, with elongated toes and claw marks at the tips. "What kind of animal leaves tracks like that?" I asked. Mark crouched down, frowning. "Probably a bear with a weird gait." "Bears don't have claws like that," Emily said, her voice trembling. Mark shrugged. "Then, maybe Bigfoot. Relax." But I couldn't relax. The tracks led straight toward our intended campsite. That night was worse. We built a larger fire and sat close to it, as though the flames could ward off whatever was out there. Mark and Emily argued about whether we should turn back. Ryan stayed quiet, staring into the fire like it held answers. Then the laughter started. It was faint at first, like children playing hide and seek in the distance. But it grew louder, circling our camp. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, grabbing his flashlight. The beam flickered and went out. He smacked it against his palm, but it stayed dead. "Jesse!" The voice was back, soft and lilting, but this time it wasn't alone. It was joined by Emily's voice, then Ryan's, all of them calling my name. "Stay by the fire," Emily whispered, clutching my arm. "Don't leave the firelight." Mark ignored her and stepped into the darkness. "Mark, no!" I shouted, but he disappeared into the trees. We waited, calling for him, but he didn't answer. Then we saw him stumble back into the light, his face pale, his eyes wide. "It's not human," he said, his voice shaking. Before we could ask what he meant, the creature emerged. It stood just beyond the firelight, its form shifting and flickering like a mirage. One moment it looked like Mark, then Emily, then me. Its face stretched into an unnatural grin, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on us. Emily screamed. Ryan fell backwards, scrambling away from the fire. "Salt!" Emily shouted suddenly. "We need salt." I remembered the packets we'd brought for meals. Grabbing them from my bag, I ripped them open and tossed the contents around the fire. The creature hissed and recoiled, its form blurring before it vanished into the shadows. We didn't sleep that night. Mark finally admitted we needed to leave. But when we reached the RV the next morning, we found the tires slashed, claw marks gouged into the doors. "It doesn't want us to leave," Emily said, her voice hollow. "Then we walk," I said. "We'll head to the ranger station." The hike was grueling. Every sound in the forest set us on edge, and the feeling of being watched never left. By midday, the creature returned. It didn't attack, but followed us, always just out of sight. Sometimes it looked like Emily, sometimes like Mark, and sometimes like something entirely inhuman. When we reached a narrow trail along a cliffside, it attacked. The creature lunged at Mark, who fought it off with a burning stick from our campfire. "Go! Go!" he shouted. "Get to the station." "Mark, no!" I screamed, but he wouldn't listen. He stood his ground, the flames casting his shadow long against the rocks. We ran. We reached the ranger station at dawn, our legs shaking, lungs burning. The creature didn't follow us into the sunlight, but Mark was gone. Even now, I dream of him standing at the edge of the woods, his eyes glowing yellow. He whispers, "Come back." I never will. I swear, if you budget travelers aren't the cheapest bunch of people around, my cousin Anne convinced me to road trip across the country. In this old RV, he scored off Craigslist his whole pitch. We'll save a fortune on hotels, dude. Yeah. Maybe if you don't factor in gas mileage for this behemoth right now, we're somewhere in Tennessee, I think. Honestly, after a while, all those back roads and state parks blur together. Don't get me wrong. It's kind of beautiful out here. Aeon's all about the hiking and nature stuff me. I'm cool as long as I've got self-service and a cold beer. At the end of the day, last night we pulled into this roadside campground on the edge of some thick, tangled woods. Figured it'd be a quick overnight, hit the road by sunrise kind of deal. But when Anne went to check us in, the campground lady, where she was at least 100, was nowhere to be found now. Most folks would call it a night, leave a note, or whatever. Not aiming, dude. He says all wide-eyed and intense free camping. Let's stitch the hookups and go wild camping. I didn't know about all that, but whatever we find this secluded spot near the woods, I kill the engine and the forest goes dead quiet. The kind of quiet that gives you the creeps, and Oblivious starts unpacking his ridiculously oversized hiking backpack, going to try and snag us some trout for dinner. He declares you want to come and miss out on setting up prime ghosts watching territory. No way, man. I laugh, already settling into the unfolded lawn share with a cold one. Amon just shrugs, tosses me a "you're lost" kind of look, and disappears into the trees. That's when things started getting weird. It's barely dusk, but the forest is already dark as pitch. All those usual night sounds, crickets and stuff, they're just absent. And I start hearing like rustling behind the RV at first. I assume it's some squirrel, but it's bigger, heavier. I peek through the RV window, see nothing, and chalk it up to paranoia. The beer probably isn't helping. Still can't shake this feeling. I'm being watched, like there's eyes on me from the woods. Then that rustling gets closer. It's definitely circling the RV. Now I grab my pocket knife off the counter, stupid. I know against whatever's out there, but it's something. Suddenly, I swear something slams into the side of the RV. The whole thing rocks. I yelp and probably drop the knife. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit I'm freaking out. I grab my cell, fumbled through my contacts, no signal, a freaking course. Whatever's out there circles again, this time letting out this growl isn't the right word. It's more like a guttural wet cough, and it's big way. Bigger than any dog or coyote I've ever heard. I picture claws scraping against the RV's metal, long teeth, beady eyes glowing in the dark. Then I see it a silhouette just for a second against the trees, massive, hunched, moving on way more than 4 legs. I can't make out details in the dark, but the shape is all wrong. Like some unnatural twisted beast out of a nightmare, my heart is pounding so hard. I'm scared. The thing can hear it. I curl up in the driver's seat, trying to become one with the upholstery. The noises outside stop, but I know it's still there. I don't dare move, don't even breathe. Right hours go by, at least I think they do. Time gets muddled when you're waiting for a monster to eat you alive. Just as I start to think. Maybe it's gone. I hear a new sound scratching right above me on the roof. That's followed by this awful wet thump, like something heavy landed up there, and then there's a scraping sound back and forth like claws on the fiberglass. I try to stifle a whimper, whatever it is. It's light enough to be on the roof, but big B enough to have shaken the entire RV earlier. The logic doesn't add up. My brain is barely functioning at this point. The scraping goes on forever, and then a new sound, sniffing, sting right outside the air vent. Above my head, I can almost feel its hot breath smell, its stinking rotten meat smell. I squeezed my eyes, shut, pray to gods. I don't believe in suddenly I hear Aeon's voice muffled through the RV walls. Dude, you in there found some killer trout, man. You gotta see he trails off. There's a pause and then a blood-curdling scream that cuts off abruptly. I flinch, then go stock. Still, the scratching on the roof stops. Silence, heavy, awful silence. I don't move an inch. Maybe if I play dead, my entire body is one giant knot of terror. I hold my breath, straining to hear any sound. That will tell me Aeon's fate, but there's nothing, just that oppressive silence. My mind races, 100 miles an hour. Should I run? Could I even make it to the trees alive? Is there a weapon somewhere in this mess? I could use that pocket. Knife is useless, and whatever's on the roof ain't going to give me time to rummage through kitchen drawers. Finally, after an eternity, I hear a noise. It's faint like a rustling deep in the woods. Whatever it is, it's retreating. Each rustle pulls the knot in my chest a little tighter. It's dragging something heavy. I don't even need to picture what it's got. My brain finally kicks into gear. I have to get out of here. I scrambled to the driver's seat, fumble with the keys, the engine coughs to life. Thank God. I gun it in reverse, barely glancing in the side mirror lights. On I floor. It bouncing down the dirt road, not looking back, must have driven for hours. I end up at some roadside all-night diner, the kind with watery coffee and sad-looking pine in a rotating case. My hand shakes so bad. I can barely hold my mug. I manage to choke down a couple of eggs and hash browns, but they sit in my stomach like lead. The waitress, an older lady with a kind face and a bad dye job, keeps refilling. My coffee The diner, mostly empty, just the trucker snoozing in a booth and a couple arguing in hushed tones. Part of me wants desperately to tell someone, anyone, what happened, to scream until the cops come and drag me out in a straitjacket. But here's the thing. How do you explain what I saw? What I heard, some backwoods beast that shouldn't exist. They'll think I'm lying or crazy, or worse, that I did something to aim in myself. Best case scenario, they'll search and find nothing. Maybe someone will come looking for me, figure out mixed up in a man's disappearance. There's no way I'm going through that when the sun rises. I ditched the RV in a grocery store parking lot, figure. The cops might trace it back to me. Less likely they'll bother with some stolen grocery getter. I don't have much on me. Some cash, a burner phone I bought for emergencies, Am's backpack with his fishing gear. I guess I'll try and hitchhike back west. This disappear into the anonymity of the city. The road stretches out ahead, endless and empty. I'll keep moving, keep changing my name, always looking over my shoulder. Maybe someday I'll find a place where I feel safe, where I can tell my story without being carted off to the loony bin. But for now, I'm just another face on the run, haunted by the memory of that thing. In the woods, they call creatures like that skin riders. That's the closest name I can come up with anyway. Urban legends, ghost stories designed to scare kids around campfires. Turns out some of those campfire stories have teeth. I wish Anne had been a little less into nature, a little more into binge watching TV, heck. I wish I had never agreed to this stupid trip in the first place. But wishing doesn't change a thing now. I'm never going to look at the woods the same way again, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every shadow that flickers at the edge of my vision is going to send a jolt of pure terror straight through me. The air was still and heavy as I stepped out of my RV, the dense canopy of the forest casting long shadows over the dirt clearing. My name is Lucas Randall, and this happened in September of 1996, somewhere in the rugged backwoods of Pennsylvania. I had been on the road for nearly a week, just me, my dog Buck, and a stubborn itch to escape the grind of my contracting business. The solitude out here was supposed to be soothing, a way to clear my head. Instead, it felt oppressive, like the trees themselves were leaning in, whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. I parked at a quiet campground tucked miles off the main highway. The ranger I'd spoken to at the entrance, a wiry guy named Dean, had warned me to keep my fire low and stick to marked trails. "You'd be surprised how easy it is to get lost out here," he said, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "And the locals aren't too keen on visitors poking around off track. Just stay where it's safe." I had laughed it off. Safe? I'd grown up in rougher places than this. My RV was stocked with enough canned food and water to last 2 weeks, and I had a reliable .357 Magnum holstered at my hip just in case. What could go wrong? By the second night, I'd grown restless. Buck was curled up on the passenger seat, snoring softly, and the night stretched endlessly outside. The crickets chirped in rhythm, their noise broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I decided to step out for a smoke. The embers of my campfire still smoldered, giving off faint heat in the cool evening. That's when I saw it, movement just beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it might have been a deer or a coyote, but then it stepped closer, just into the faint glow of the fire. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with limbs too long and lean for its torso, like something that had been stretched and warped. Its body was pale and slick-looking, almost like the underbelly of a fish. The thing had no fur or hair, just skin pulled taut over bones. The way it moved was unnerving, with a slow, deliberate gait, as if it had all the time in the world. I froze. Buck's growl from inside the RV broke my paralysis. My hand shot to my holster as the thing's head cocked sharply, like it had just realized it wasn't alone. It let out a sound, not a roar, not a howl, just a strange chittering noise that sent a cold spike of fear down my spine. Without thinking, I shouted, "Hey! Get out of here!" My voice sounded pathetic, even to me. The thing didn't flinch. Instead, it crouched low and launched itself forward, clearing the fire pit in a single fluid motion. I barely had time to react. My gun came up, and I fired. The shot cracked through the night, but the thing was fast. Too fast. The bullet only grazed its side, leaving a dark smear on its pale skin. It didn't even slow down. Buck barked wildly, clawing at the window of the RV, but I was already moving. I bolted toward the RV door, slamming it shut just as the thing's long, clawed hands swiped at my back. The window cracked under its weight as it ran along the side of the vehicle back, its chittering turning into a low, guttural clicking. I fumbled to reload, my hands shaking. The RV rocked violently as the creature climbed onto the roof. Buck was barking and snarling, pacing back and forth like he wanted to tear through the door. I grabbed a flashlight and swung it toward the ceiling, hoping the light might drive it off. But before I could do anything else, the roof caved in with a deafening crunch. I don't remember screaming, but I must have because my throat felt raw as I scrambled for the back door. The creature dropped into the cabin, its bony legs bending unnaturally as it landed. Its head swiveled toward me, its sharp teeth bared in something that might have been a grin. I fired again. This time, the shot tore through its shoulder. The thing shrieked and lunged at me, its claws raking the air just inches from my face. I swung a wrench, a heavy one I used for repairs, smashing it across the side of its head. It stumbled, but not for long. Buck charged, leaping at the creature with a ferocity I'd never seen before. He clamped his jaws around its arm, tearing into the slick flesh. The thing let out a horrible noise and swatted him aside. Buck hit the wall with a yelp and crumpled to the floor, his body limp. Rage overtook the fear in my chest. I grabbed a propane canister from the kitchenette and hurled it at the creature. The impact sent it reeling, but I wasn't done. Grabbing a lighter from my pocket, I flicked it on and threw it at the leaking gas. The explosion was deafening. Flames roared through the RV, and the creature's high-pitched screeches pierced the chaos. I dove out the back door, rolling onto the ground as heat and smoke billowed around me. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the crackling of fire. Then I saw it emerge from the flames, charred but still standing. It stumbled forward, its movements jerky and uncoordinated like a puppet with tangled strings. But it was weaker now. Slower. I didn't give it a chance to recover. Gripping my wrench tightly, I swung with all the strength I had left. The impact cracked through the air, and the thing crumpled to the ground. I kept hitting it again and again until it stopped moving. By the time I stopped, my arms felt like lead, and my chest heaved with every breath. The creature lay sprawled in the dirt, its body twitching faintly before going still. Its skin was torn and burned, blackened by the fire. The headlights of a park ranger's truck cut through the trees. Dean jumped out, his face pale as he took in the scene. The wrecked RV, the smoldering fire, and the mangled creature at my feet. He didn't say a word, just stared, his hand hovering near the radio on his belt. Buck stirred behind me, letting out a weak whine. I dropped to my knees, relief washing over me as I realized he was still alive. Dean finally found his voice. "What the hell is that thing?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The thing's lifeless body sprawled in the dirt was all the answer he'd get. My name's Max Holloway, and back in 2017, I decided to take my old RV on a trip to Badlands National Park in South Dakota. I'd always thought that spending some time alone in the wilderness might help me sort out my tangled thoughts, or at least give me a good excuse to avoid my ex's wedding. You know, just a guy and his questionable life choices, hitting the open road. I'd been on the road for a couple of days when I finally reached the park. The rugged landscape of eroded buttes and pinnacles stretched out before me like a scene from another planet. It was the kind of place where you half expected to find dinosaurs still roaming around. I parked my RV at a secluded spot, far from the few other campers who dared to brave the isolation setting up camp. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of excitement and unease. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that whispered through the canyons. I cracked a joke to myself about finally finding a place quieter than my love life with a self-deprecating chuckle. I settled into a folding chair and watched the sun begin. Its slow descent as night fell, the sky transformed into a tapestry of stars. I'd never seen so many in my life. It was like the universe had decided to show off, and I was its sole audience. I made myself a simple dinner over a campfire, canned beans, and Frank's gourmet by my standards. The crackling fire and the vastness of the night sky made me feel both insignificant and oddly content around midnight. I decided to turn in. The RV was cozy enough, and I was looking forward to a good night's sleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint noise outside, a sort of rustling like footsteps on gravel. I sat up listening intently, probably just an animal. I told myself maybe a deer or a raccoon looking for scraps, but then I heard it again closer. This time definitely footsteps, and they didn't sound like they belonged to a four-legged creature. I peered out the small window but saw nothing in the inky darkness, grabbing a flashlight. I mustered the courage to step outside. Who's there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady silence. I swept the flashlight beam across the landscape, its narrow cone revealing nothing but the twisted shapes of rock formations and sparse vegetation, feeling a bit foolish. I decided to double-check that the RV was locked up tight, satisfied. I headed back inside and chalked it up to my imagination. Just as I was about to lie down again, a loud thud reverberated from the back of the RV. My heart leaped into my throat. This was no raccoon. I grabbed a tire iron from under the seat, my only makeshift weapon, and crept toward the rear. Okay, Max, I whispered to myself. It's probably nothing. Maybe a branch fell or a rock slid. No need to panic. My attempt at self-reassurance wasn't particularly convincing. Another thud, more forceful. This time shook the entire vehicle. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a deep breath and flung open the rear door, brandishing the tire iron. The flashlight beam danced wildly as my shaky hand struggled to hold it steady there. Just beyond the reach of the light stood a figure, tall, gaunt, and utterly motionless. "Hey, who are you?" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative, but failing miserably. The figure stepped forward into the light, revealing a man with a weathered face and piercing gaze. His clothes were tattered, stained with what looked alarmingly like dried blood. He smiled a slow, unsettling grin that sent a chill down my spine. "Nice night for camping, isn't it?" He said, his voice raspy. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," I replied, tightening my grip on the tire iron. "Neither do I," he said, taking another step closer. "Just thought I'd make a new friend out here in the middle of nowhere." "Well, you've made your introduction now. If you don't mind, I'd like to get some sleep." He tilted his head, as if pondering my request. "Sleep is the cousin of death. You know, yeah, and curiosity killed the cat." "What's your point?" I snapped, hoping a bit of sarcasm might mask my fear. He chuckled softly. "Oh, like you've got spirit without warning." He lunged at me. I swung the tire iron wildly, connecting with his shoulder. He grunted, but didn't stop. We grappled, stumbling backward into the RV. He was stronger than he looked, and his hands clawed at my throat in the chaos. I noticed a hunting knife strapped to his belt, desperate. I kneed him in the groin. He doubled over just enough for me to snatch the knife. Adrenaline surged through me as I held the blade between us. "Back off," I shouted. He paused, eyes flickering to the knife, then back to me. "You don't have it in you." He sneered. "Try me," I growled. He lunged again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I thrust the knife forward, feeling it sink into his side. He gasped, stumbling backward out of the RV, clutching his wound. He glared at me with a mix of surprise and fury. "This isn't over," he hissed before disappearing into the darkness. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. My mind raced. Who was this guy? What did he want? More importantly, was he coming back? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every shadow put me on high alert as dawn broke. I decided it was time to get the hell out of there. I started the RV and sped down the dusty roads, not bothering to admire the morning light casting eerie shadows on the rock formations. As I neared the park's exit, I saw flashing red and blue lights blocking the road. A police officer flagged me down. Relieved, I pulled over. "Morning, sir." The officer said, "Are you alone?" "Yes, officer, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't glad to see you." He nodded grimly. "We've had reports of a dangerous individual in the area. Have you seen anyone suspicious?" "Actually, I had a run-in last night," I replied, recounting the night's events. The officer's expression grew more serious. "Can you describe him?" I provided as many details as I could. The tattered clothes, the knife, the unsettling grin that matches the description. He said, "Name's Vincent Kane, escaped convict. He's been on the run." "For weeks, great," I muttered. "Just my luck to meet the one guy out here who's more lost than I am." The officer managed a tight smile. "You're fortunate to be alive. We'll need you to make a statement. Happy to oblige, as long as it means he's off the streets." They took my statement, and I spent the next few hours assisting with their report. As it turned out, Vincent Kane was a convicted murderer who had escaped during a prison transfer. The blood on his clothes, light ally, belonged to a hiker reported missing a few days. After wrapping up with the police, I decided to cut my trip. Short solitude was overrated when it came with a side of potential homicide. As I drove away, I couldn't help but think about the absurdity of it all. I'd gone looking for peace and quiet and found anything. But on the bright side, at least, I'd have a heck of a story to tell, assuming anyone would believe me. Maybe next time I'd opt for a crowded beach resort. Instead, sure, I'd have to deal with overpriced cocktails and kids kicking sand, but that suddenly seemed like a fair trade. In the final analysis, Vincent Kane was a stark reminder that real monsters don't hide under beds. They wander the same roads. We do, just waiting for an opportunity. My name is Ethan Shaw, and I was 35 years old when this happened in October 2021. I'm a freelance writer, mostly covering travel and folklore. I've spent years chasing stories, driving my RV from one place to the next, always seeking inspiration, or maybe just running away. Back then, I thought of myself as independent, untethered, invincible. But Spruce Knob changed that. It was supposed to be a quick trip. I'd heard whispers about a place in West Virginia where strange things happened. Laughing voices in the woods, small footprints appearing where no child had walked in decades. The locals called it the Lost Children of Spruce Knob. The legend was vague, tied to an old settlement that had long since disappeared. A winter storm, children wandering too far, and a tragedy that no one liked to talk about. It was exactly the kind of story my editor loved. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The drive had been rough, the winding roads climbing higher and higher into the dense forest. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that settles in your bones. My RV sputtered a bit as I parked, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to minor mechanical issues. The campsite was deserted, just how I liked it. Solitude made it easier to write. I spent the first hour setting up, unpacking my laptop and notes, snapping a few photos of the eerie, misty forest for my article. By the time I lit a small fire, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a dusky blue. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, like the distant hum of the wind. But as I sat by the fire sipping lukewarm coffee, the sound grew clearer. Laughter, high-pitched and playful, like children chasing each other in a game of tag. I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. The nearest town was miles away. Who would bring children all the way out here at night? Hello? I called, my voice shaky. The laughter stopped. I stood, shining my flashlight toward the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of too many ghost stories and too much caffeine. But as I turned back to the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found footprints. They were small, barefoot, pressed into the dirt just outside my RV. A trail of them circled the fire pit and wandered toward the trees. My stomach churned. I crouched, running my fingers over one of the prints. It couldn't have been there long. The edges were still sharp, undisturbed by wind or dew. I took a photo, the click of my camera loud in the still morning air. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, straightening. But even as I brushed it off, my pulse quickened. I spent the day exploring, hiking through the dense woods with my notebook in hand. The forest felt oppressive, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every twig snapping underfoot. I found an abandoned cabin about a mile from the campsite, its roof caved in, walls covered in moss and lichen. Inside, I discovered old yellowed pages scattered across the floor. The handwriting was faint, but I could make out enough to piece together the story. The cabin had belonged to a family who'd settled here in the 1800s. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. During a brutal winter, the father sent the children out to gather firewood. A storm rolled in suddenly, and they never came back. Their bodies were never found, and the parents were said to have gone mad with grief. I shivered, hugging my coat tighter. The pages felt heavy in my hands, the words pressing into my mind like a weight. That night, the laughter returned. It started faintly, just like before, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the RV, but then it grew more deliberate. Tap. Tap, tap, like small fingers drumming against the window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden under my blanket, to pretend I didn't hear it. But curiosity is a terrible thing. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept toward the window. The fog outside was thick, swirling like smoke. But through it, I saw a shape, a small figure standing just beyond the fire pit. My breath caught. It was a little girl, no older than 7, with long hair tangled around her face. Her dress was ragged, her bare feet pale against the damp earth. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted, as if waiting for me to step outside. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. "No," I whispered. "No way." The tapping stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, she was gone. The next morning, my RV wouldn't start. I turned the key over and over, but the engine just coughed and sputtered. The battery was fine, the fuel gauge full. I had no explanation. "Great," I muttered, slamming the steering wheel. Just great. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. I was stranded. Determined to distract myself, I decided to hike back to the cabin. Maybe I could find more of the journal pages, something to help me understand what was happening. But as I neared the cabin, the forest seemed darker, the air colder. I found the doll on the trail. It was old, its fabric faded and torn, one button eye missing. It hadn't been there the day before. I hesitated, staring at it. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a flicker of motion among the trees. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. "Marlene," a voice whispered. I spun around, my pulse racing. Marlene. It was a child's voice, soft and pleading, coming from deeper in the woods. "Nope," I said again, backing away. But as I turned to leave, the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Help us." I ran. By the time I reached the RV, I was shaking, my rational mind unraveling, every explanation I'd clung to slipping through my fingers. I locked the door and curled up on the bed, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The children didn't wait for nightfall this time. The laughter echoed through the forest, closer and louder than ever. Shadows darted outside the windows, too quick to be seen clearly. The tapping returned, relentless and mocking. And then they came inside. I didn't see them enter, but suddenly they were there. 3 small figures standing at the foot of my bed. Their faces were pale and frostbitten, their eyes wide and hollow. "Why didn't they come back for us?" the little girl asked, her voice like a cold wind. I don't know," I stammered. "They promised," the boy said. "They promised they'd come back." My breath hitched as tears filled my eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They stared at me, their expressions unreadable, and then they were gone. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I gathered firewood and built a small pyre near the cabin. I placed the doll on top, along with an offering of food and a scarf I found in my RV. Lighting the fire, I whispered a prayer, not to any god I knew, but to the lost children. "I hope this helps," I said, my voice cracking. "I hope it guides you home." The air grew still, the forest holding its breath. For a moment, I thought I'd failed. But then the fire flared, a brilliant golden light that chased away the shadows. The fog lifted. The forest seemed quieter, calmer. When I returned to the RV, it started on the first try. I never wrote the article. Some stories aren't meant to be told, and some wounds aren't meant to be reopened. But I left Spruce Knob with a strange sense of peace, as if the children had finally found their way. And maybe in some small way, so had I. My name is Daniel Fisher, and I was 25 years old when this happened in the fall of 2022. I've always been a skeptic. Science, facts, logic. That's my religion. Ghost stories and urban legends? They're just entertainment, a way for people to make sense of what they can't explain. At least that's what I thought before that weekend in Dolly Sods. It was supposed to be a routine backpacking trip. Just me, my best friend Chris, and his girlfriend Lila. Chris and I had been hiking together since college, and while Lila was newer to the group, she was no rookie. She'd done some Appalachian Trail sections and could hold her own. The plan was simple: 3 days in Dolly Sods Wilderness, a rugged stretch of land in West Virginia known for its otherworldly landscapes. Chris had picked it after reading about its haunted reputation. I rolled my eyes, but agreed. It would be a good story for him to tell over beers. We set off on a Friday morning, our packs heavy with gear, water, and food. The first few hours were uneventful. The air was crisp, the trail well marked, and the scenery stunning. Lila walked a few paces ahead, her long braids swinging as she stopped every so often to snap photos. Chris was his usual self, cracking jokes about the ghosts watching us. "You think Casper's going to show up and roast marshmallows with us?" he said, nudging my arm. "More like Bigfoot," I replied. "Hope you packed extra jerky." By midday, we'd veered off the main trail onto a less traveled path. That was our first mistake. Chris insisted it would be more authentic, a word that always meant trouble. Lila looked uneasy but didn't argue. I should have turned us back then, but my pride wouldn't let me admit we were heading into uncharted territory. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The sky was clear, and the stars were so bright you could almost forget civilization existed. After dinner, we sat around the fire, trading stories and laughing. Lila was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to the trees every so often. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said quickly, forcing a smile. I don't know. This place feels weird, like it's watching us." Chris laughed. "The sods have eyes, huh?" "Don't worry, babe, I'll protect you from the big bad forest." I rolled my eyes. "Let's call it a night. Long day tomorrow." We crawled into our tents, and I was out within minutes. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of whispers, faint, like they were carried on the wind. I lay still, straining to hear. It wasn't words exactly, more like a murmur, but it felt deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. "Chris?" I called softly. No answer. I swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. Just the flicker of dying embers in the fire pit and the sway of the trees. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to sleep. The next morning, Lila looked pale, dark circles under her eyes. "You okay?" Chris asked, pouring her a cup of instant coffee. She hesitated. "I heard something last night, whispering." Chris grinned. "I see. I told you, ghosts. They probably wanted some s'mores." I expected her to laugh, but she didn't. Instead, she shot me a look like she was silently asking if I'd heard it too. I nodded and her face tightened. We packed up and moved on, but the mood was different. Lila kept glancing over her shoulder, and even Chris was quieter than usual. By midday, our GPS started acting up, refusing to lock onto satellites. I pulled out the paper map, but it was no use. The terrain didn't match anything on it. "We're lost," I said. "Let's just backtrack," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. Chris shook his head. "We're fine. The trail's got to be around here somewhere." We pressed on, but the more we walked, the stranger things became. The trees seemed closer together, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. And then there were the tracks, hoofprints in the mud, but not from any deer. They were too deep, too large. Some even looked like they ended in clawed toes. I tried to dismiss them, but Lila froze when she saw them. "This isn't normal," she whispered. Chris shrugged. "Probably just an old cow or something." "In the middle of dolly sods," she snapped. "We're miles from any farms." We kept walking, but the tension was palpable. That evening, we stumbled upon a clearing with a circle of stones in the center. At first, I thought it was a fire pit, but as we got closer, I saw the bones, animal bones, bleached white and arranged in strange patterns. Chris let out a nervous laugh. "Well, that's not creepy at all." "We need to leave," Lila said firmly. "Now? It's just some weirdo's idea of art," Chris said. But even he looked uneasy. "Let's camp somewhere else." We moved another mile before setting up camp, but none of us slept well. The whispers came again, louder this time and closer. They weren't just sounds, they were voices calling our names. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like Chris outside my tent. His voice low and urgent. "Jake, come here." I unzipped the tent, but he wasn't there, just darkness and the rustle of leaves. When I checked his tent, he was sound asleep. The next morning, Lila refused to go any further. "I'm done," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to go back." "We don't even know which way back is," Chris argued. "Then we stay put and wait for help." "Out here? With no signal? No way." I sided with Chris, though I regretted it almost immediately. By midday, we were hopelessly lost, the forest closing in around us. That's when it took Chris. He'd wandered off to relieve himself while Lila and I rested by a fallen log. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When he didn't come back, we called his name. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and started searching, Lila close behind. We found him an hour later, or what was left of him. He was hanging from a tree, his face twisted in terror, his body mangled like something had torn him apart. Lila screamed, and I barely kept from throwing up. We didn't stay to examine him. We ran. By nightfall, we were utterly lost. The whispers followed us, louder now, more insistent. And then we saw it, a figure at the edge of our firelight. It looked human, but its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally. Its glowing eyes burned into me, and when it spoke, it used my voice. "Jake, come here." Lila started chanting under her breath, something about sage and protection. The figure hissed and retreated, but I knew it wasn't gone. We didn't sleep that night, and by dawn we were stumbling through the forest, exhausted and terrified. When we finally reached the edge of the woods, I almost cried. We collapsed near a ranger station, and when they found us, we tried to explain, but no one believed us. They chalked it up to exposure and trauma. Chris's body was never found. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't plan to. Whatever's out there, it's not meant to be understood. And I know one thing for sure, some legends are real. My name is Emily Allen, and I'm 30 years old. This happened along Paint Creek Scenic Trail in West Virginia during a trip I'd planned to reconnect with my art and, frankly, myself. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of the world, but instead it became something I still can't fully explain. I had just come off a long relationship that ended in the kind of breakup that leaves you questioning everything. Your choices, your direction, your worth. Art was the only thing that felt steady, so I packed up my RV and hit the road. Paint Creek had come up in my research as a serene, lesser-known spot for nature lovers. I thought it would be the perfect place to spend a few days sketching and painting in solitude. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described. Quiet, secluded, and hauntingly beautiful. The creek meandered through dense woods, its surface catching the sunlight like shards of glass. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I parked my RV near an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge looked like it belonged in a ghost story, its weathered boards sagging slightly, but I couldn't resist its charm. I set up camp and spent the first day wandering the trails and sketching the landscape. The stillness was almost too perfect, but I chalked it up to being unused to this level of isolation. That night, I sat by the creek working on a watercolor of the bridge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around me grew darker and the silence became oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. I tried to focus on my painting, but a strange unease crept over me. It was like the air had shifted, growing heavier, colder. And then I heard it, a faint humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but it didn't seem to have a source. It wasn't coming from the creek or the woods. It was just there. I froze, my brush hovering over the paper. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was a woman's voice humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I'd startled it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it must have been the wind or some trick of acoustics. I packed up my supplies and hurried back to the RV. The next morning, I woke to find my art supplies scattered across the ground outside the RV. My brushes were snapped in half, my paint spilled and smeared across the dirt. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into them, but there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance other than the destruction itself. It didn't make sense. I spent the day trying to paint, but something felt off. The colors didn't look right, the lines felt shaky. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore more of the area. The old bridge drew me in again, its weathered planks creaking under my boots as I crossed it. The creek below was impossibly still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the gnarled tree overhead. On the far side of the bridge, I noticed something etched into one of the trees, a name and a date carved deep into the bark, Margaret, 1893. The letters were uneven, as if done in haste, but what caught my attention was the feeling that swept over me as I touched the carving, a sudden, overwhelming sadness that didn't feel like my own. That night, the humming returned. I was inside the RV, trying to sketch, when I heard it again, drifting through the stillness. It was louder this time, unmistakable. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was icy, much colder than it had been earlier, and the forest was eerily quiet. The humming led me to the bridge, where the fog had thickened, shrouding the creek in an otherworldly glow. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek, her back to me. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She was humming that same mournful tune, the sound weaving through the air like a spell. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped humming but didn't turn around. I took a hesitant step closer, and as I did, she began to dissolve, her form breaking apart like mist until there was nothing left but the fog. I stood there frozen, unsure if what I'd seen was real or some trick of the light in my overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to drive into town to clear my head. At a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed to know the area well. "You're camping by the bridge, aren't you?" he asked when I mentioned Paint Creek. "Yeah. Why?" He hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. They call her the Lady of Paint Creek. Story goes she was abandoned by her husband during a harsh winter. He promised to come back for her, but he never did. She waited by that bridge until she froze to death. Now she haunts the creek, looking for people to join her." I laughed nervously, but his expression remained serious. "I'd avoid that bridge if I were you," he added, "especially at night." That evening, I couldn't stay away. Something about the Lady of Paint Creek drew me in like a moth to a flame. I set up my easel near the bridge, determined to capture her essence in my painting. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in again and the humming returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. The air around me grew colder, and when I looked up, there she was, standing in the middle of the bridge. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. She didn't move, but the humming turned into words, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Stay with me." I backed away, but my foot slipped on the wet grass and I fell. When I looked up, she was gone, but the feeling of her presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was standing on the bridge, staring down at the icy water. She appeared beside me, her hand cold as she touched my arm. "He left me," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "They all leave." When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. I knew I had to do something to end this, to break her hold on me. On my final night at Paint Creek, I returned to the bridge with my sketchbook and paints. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seeped into my bones. I set up my supplies and began to paint, my hands trembling as I worked. I painted her story, the bridge, the creek, her lonely figure waiting in the snow. As I finished, the humming surrounded me, and she appeared again, this time closer. Her hollow eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward the painting. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "You're remembered now," I said, my voice breaking. "You're not forgotten." She stared at the painting for what felt like an eternity, then dissolved into the mist, her presence lifting like a weight from my chest. The forest grew quiet again, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I left Paint Creek the next morning, the painting tucked safely in the RV. It's one of my best works, but I've never been able to sell it. Something about it feels sacred, like it belongs to her. Even now, I hear her humming in my dreams, but it's softer now, almost peaceful, as if she's finally found rest. And maybe in a way, so have I. My name is Emma Williams, and I'm 40 years old. This happened last October when I decided to camp alone at Smoke Hollow, a remote site near the Greenbrier River in West Virginia. I thought it would be a quiet, picturesque trip, a chance to photograph the eerie beauty of an old settlement long forgotten by time. Instead, I barely made it out alive. The idea came to me while scrolling through an article about abandoned places. Smoke Hollow was once a bustling logging village in the late 1800s, but in the early 1900s, its population vanished under mysterious circumstances. All that remained were the ruins of a few homes and a cemetery overgrown with moss and wild ivy. Local legends spoke of ghostly wails echoing through the hollow at night. But I figured those were just stories to scare off tourists. I was drawn to the place because it sounded like the perfect subject for my blog, Forgotten Trails. After my divorce, exploring remote and spooky locations became my therapy. Documenting these places filled the empty hours and gave me purpose. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I welcomed it. At least that's what I told myself. The road to Smoke Hollow was narrow and winding, with ancient trees towering on either side. By the time I arrived at the campground, the late afternoon sun was hidden behind thick gray clouds. The place was deserted, except for a lone park ranger at the check-in station. "First time here?" she asked, smiling. Her name tag read Maya Andrews. "Yeah, heard about it online," I said. Maya nodded. "Beautiful spot, but it can be disorienting. Fog rolls in heavy, and the echoes in the hollow can mess with your sense of direction. Stay on marked paths and you'll be fine." Her words didn't bother me. I'd camped alone before. I smiled, thanked her, and drove to my site near the river. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint earthy smell of decaying leaves. I parked my RV, set up my gear, and took a short hike to the cemetery before nightfall. The graveyard was small, maybe 20 headstones, most of them cracked or leaning. One in particular caught my eye. A child's grave marked Lillian Reed, 1898-1905. A small lamb was carved into the stone, worn smooth by time. I snapped a few photos, the sky darkening faster than I expected, and headed back to camp. That night, the fog came in thick and fast, pressing against the RV windows like a living thing. I was reviewing my photos when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched wail cutting through the silence. It sounded like a child crying. I froze, my heart thumping. It couldn't be an animal. It was too human. I turned off the lights and peered outside. The fog distorted everything, but I saw no movement. I told myself it was just the wind and tried to go back to editing, but the cry came again, this time closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, sighed, shivering in the cold. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the mist. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Just the river gurgling faintly in the distance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I went back inside, I locked the door and pulled the blinds shut. It was a long time before I fell asleep. The next morning, I found wet handprints on my RV windows, small ones like a child's. My stomach churned. The fog had cleared, leaving the woods damp and muddy, but there were no tracks around the RV, no signs anyone had been there. Shaking off the unease, I decided to head back to the cemetery. It was brighter in the daylight, though the thick canopy still gave the place a shadowy quality. I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. A journal, lying partially buried beneath a toppled tombstone. Curiosity got the better of me. I brushed off the dirt and opened it. The faded handwriting belonged to someone named Eleanor Reed, likely a mother to the child whose grave I'd seen. The entries were ordinary at first, mentioning chores and weather, but they took a darker turn near the end. One passage stuck with me. "Lillian hears them at night, the crying children. I thought she was dreaming, but now I hear them too. We must leave, but the forest won't let us go." My hands trembled as I closed the journal. It was just an old story, I told myself, a grieving mother's imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with this place. That night, the crying returned, louder and more insistent. I stayed inside, clutching my flashlight. The sound circled the RV as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to follow. I fought the urge to look, but then the generator failed, plunging me into complete darkness. I scrambled for my backup lantern, fumbling with the switch. When it flickered to life, I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading from the door to the far corner of the RV. My breath caught. The crying had stopped, replaced by faint, rapid tapping on the windows. "Go away," I whispered, backing into a corner. The tapping grew louder, frantic, then stopped altogether. The silence was worse. I felt trapped, as though the darkness was closing in, suffocating me. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was exhausted and desperate to leave. But when I stepped outside, I saw deep scratches raked across the RV's exterior. The tires were slashed, the rubber shredded like paper. My heart sank. I was stranded. I decided to hike back to the cemetery, hoping to find a clue in Eleanor's journal or at least distract myself, but the path felt different this time. Unfamiliar. The trees seemed to shift around me, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. I stumbled into the clearing, and my blood ran cold. A figure stood by Lillian's grave. At first, I thought it was a child, but something about its proportions was wrong. Its arms too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It turned toward me, and I saw its face, hollow eyes and a wide, dripping grin. Water pooled around its feet, soaking the earth. I couldn't move. It opened its mouth, emitting a guttural, inhuman wail that echoed through the trees. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran, the sound chasing me all the way back to the RV. That night, the entity attacked. It battered the RV, its cries deafening. The windows rattled, the walls creaked. I remembered the journal's warning. The forest won't let us go. But it wasn't the forest. It was this thing. This embodiment of grief and rage. I thought of what Maya had said about echoes. Desperate, I turned on my phone and played a voice recording I'd taken of her advice. Stay near the marked paths. Her calm, human voice cut through the chaos like a beacon. The entity recoiled, its form flickering. I grabbed the journal, clutching it like a talisman, and shouted, "Lillian, stop! You're free!" The wailing stopped. The air grew still. For a moment, I thought it was over, until I heard a soft, wet laugh behind me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. The RV was abandoned behind me. A passing car picked me up, and I barely managed to explain what had happened. When we passed Smoke Hollow, I saw the figure standing in the fog, its hollow eyes following me. I never went back to Smoke Hollow. The photos I took were strange, blurry, distorted, as though the camera couldn't quite capture the truth. But one image haunts me most. A figure standing by Lillian's grave, its face staring straight into the lens. And I've stopped camping alone. Some silences are meant to stay undisturbed.